see behind me, we're at the very beginning of the All Under One Banner rally. You can obviously hear the pipers behind me as events are about to kick off.
The UK Tory government is taking the Scottish Government and the Scottish Parliament to court, questioning the legality of the act that has been passed by a cross-party majority in the Scottish Parliament to try and protect devolved law from the consequences of Brexit.
What's your thoughts on Brexit?
I think it's an absolute burdock.
I think the Brexit debate really, and the mess that's being made, is kind of supercharging the independence discussion.
The fact that Broadcasting Scotland, about the work that's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists, a platform other than the traditional media outlets coming from other countries and other third parties. I think it's really important that not only myself but other elected members are supporting Broadcasting Scotland.
We've had the Independence March at the weekend, the biggest Independence March that the country's ever seen. We've had the polls that have come out that have showed on a hard Brexit there's a majority for independence. The polls that have shown that the SNP's 20 percentage points ahead in votes for Holyrood. This is a party which is on the march. It's a government which is popular. We've got to take the people of Scotland by the hand and tell them to come with us on that journey to finish the job. We know that Scotland will become independent, it's just a question of when that will happen.
Broadcasting Scotland needs to be ready to provide fair, impartial and balanced reporting of the events that matter to the people in Scotland. This is why today we're launching a crowdfunding campaign with the ambition of raising £30,000, which is needed to invest in the development of our studio and infrastructure. Broadcasting Scotland can only exist with the backing of our supporters, so please follow the link below and give as generously as you can. We have used every penny we've ever received for making programmes for you, and we guarantee your money will be put to good use.
Buttons now. And I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, in the period since the debate on P1 assessments, I have considered the arguments put forward and taken time to discuss ways forward with colleagues in local government and education. I am keen to address the intent of the parliamentary motion, take account of the evidence and recognise the duty we all carry to ensure our education system enables pupils to achieve their potential. There is a great deal of agreement on a number of points within the terms of the motion that Parliament supported. It highlighted that good quality pupil assessment is an essential component of the drive to raise educational standards in Scotland's schools. I agree with that. It was a key element of the joint statement that the Scottish Government issued with the Association of Directors of Education, ADES, in September. It is vital that we have the appropriate approach to assessment, as we would be failing children and their families if we did not. The motion also highlighted the need to ensure that the P1 assessments are in line with the play-based learning philosophy of the early years provision in the Curriculum for Excellence. I also agree with that. The early level of CFE explicitly provides for play-based learning, and any assessment mechanism must reflect that approach. I believe that an assessment which lasts less than an hour in a year and is deployed in the correct environment is entirely compatible with that play-based approach. I do, however, fully recognise that view is not shared by all and accept the importance of ensuring the specific design of the assessments are aligned with a play-based approach. I have reflected on the concerns raised by colleagues in this chamber. I have read the feedback from teachers provided by the EIS, from parents and others, and I acknowledge the concerns raised. But it is also important to acknowledge that others have had a positive experience. Overall, Primary 1 children responded positively to the SNSAs in both literacy and numeracy, was the view of one school. This feedback is included in case studies on the P1 assessment experience that will be published shortly as part of our user review of the assessments. While I am aware of the concerns that some parents have, ADES have confirmed that no directors of education have raised any significant concerns by parents in relation to the P1 assessments. This mixed picture must give us all cause to reflect and consider the best way forward. It strikes me that I'm yet to hear a compelling argument about how and why Scotland has undertaken standardised assessments for P1 pupils for so many years, sometimes twice a year, without any concerns being raised by teachers, parents or indeed politicians until now. No concerns were raised that these previous assessments, many of which were similar to SNSA, were not compatible with play-based learning. I can only conclude that it must be that the education system found the assessments that have been in place for some time helpful and informative and a useful part of their overall assessment of children's learning. Another conclusion might be that some oppose the assessments because they are national assessments and they believe them to be high-stakes tests that we want to use for accountability purposes. They are absolutely not that. The key measure the Scottish Government will use for assessing the standards of education is teacher professional judgment, not the outcomes of the standardised assessments. The standardised assessments are just one part of the range of evidence that a teacher will call on when assessing whether a child or young person has achieved the appropriate CFE level. The primary purpose of the SNSAs is to support teachers in planning, learning and teaching, whether in P1, P4, P7 or S3. Indeed, because they are diagnostic assessments and because they are specifically aligned to the early level of CFE, the SNSA should be a better and more effective tool for teachers to use than the variety of previous assessments. I've also considered the advice from those charged with delivering education in Scotland. In our debate last month, I quoted the Association of Directors of Education in Scotland President Maureen McKenna, who said that we suffer too much in education from decisions made too quickly. My ask is for politicians to pause and allow us time to evaluate. ADES also wrote to all local authority directors of education earlier this month and emphasised these points: that assessment is a key part of learning and that it is too soon to pass judgment on whether SNSA are a useful tool for teachers. The ADES is committed to working to improve and enhance assessments. And thirdly, that the importance of keeping the educational argument central, specifically that the use of assessments to inform learning are decisions for the profession to make. Given that the vast majority of local authorities have been running P1 standardised assessments for years, I believe that we have to give due consideration to the established approach of authorities and practitioners. The motion passed by Parliament gives no clarity to local authorities that if we drop SNSA, what should be done with their own standardised assessment programmes. This could see a return to P1s being assessed twice, whilst also removing the elements of national consistency and alignment with curriculum for excellence that are the key benefits of the Scottish National Standardised Assessments. That is the type of unintended consequence that can be created by a decision of this type by Parliament. I ask Parliament to recognise that cannot be a beneficial outcome of this debate. Presiding Officer, ultimately, I acknowledge that Parliament has formally taken a position that P1 assessments should be halted. But I also contend we must give due consideration to the established practice of the overwhelming majority of local authorities who carried out a form of P1 assessment, believing that to be in the best interests of pupils. We face two competing considerations. I have therefore decided to commission an independent review of the approach to P1 assessments within the context of the National Improvement Framework. The objective of the review will be to reconsider the evidence as the parliamentary motion asks me to do. I've asked Her Majesty's Chief Inspector of Education to provide me with advice on who should carry out this independent review. The review will consider and provide recommendations on the following issues: the compatibility of the assessments with the play-based approach to early level of curriculum for excellence, the alignment of the assessments to the benchmarks for early level, the effect of taking an online assessment on P1 children, the usefulness of the diagnostic information provided to teachers and how it supports their professional judgment, the implications of the review for the ongoing development of the National Gaelic Medium Education Standardised Assessments, and the future of the assessments, considering in particular whether they continue in line with the current continuous improvement model, whether they be substantially modified, or whether they should be stopped. I would welcome the input of the other parties to the formulation of the remit of the review and the appointment of its leadership. An independent evidence-based review could come to the same conclusion that I have reached, that P1 assessment should be reformed, not abolished. But I want to be very clear with the Chamber today that the outcome of the review could be a recommendation to stop the assessments. The review will be led by the evidence and by what is best for pupils. That is, I believe, the right way to resolve the competing considerations that we faced following the vote of Parliament last month. The review will be asked to provide conclusions and recommendations on each of these issues by the end of May 2019. This will allow time for us to digest the findings and for Parliament to debate them prior to the summer recess. To properly inform it, the review will clearly need to see the assessments in operation, so I reiterate my previous advice that schools should continue with their existing plans in relation to the implementation of SNSA in 2018-19. By proceeding with the assessments this year, we will generate a larger evidence base to see how the improvements we have already introduced are working and what other changes could be made. To do otherwise would simply generate uncertainty and confusion during the school year. The Scottish Government advice is clear about the timing of assessments, that this should not involve all children being assessed in blocks or windows. Local authorities should work collaboratively with head teachers to agree plans for the assessments, taking account of the needs of the children and young people involved. This sits comfortably with the ADES advice that the timing of the assessment should be driven by educational arguments. This was made clear in the recent ADES advice to directors, which said there is no need for a window to be identified when assessments must be carried out. Teachers' judgment is key here, and that judgment should be left to teachers to make based on the interests of their pupils. I ask colleagues across the Chamber to move this discussion away from politics, to focus on the educational needs of our children, and to support the independent review of P1 assessments that I've set out today.
Thank you. We'll move now to questions, starting with Liz Smith, to be followed by Ian Gray. Liz Smith.
Thank you. And can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and draw his attention to a comment that he made on the 15th of March 2001, whilst criticising the then Scottish Executive, when he said, and I quote, "People expect this Parliament to decide." Does the Cabinet Secretary still believe that the will of this Parliament is paramount? Does he believe that this Parliament voted to act upon the evidence already provided by a large number of Primary 1 teachers who were telling the Cabinet Secretary that the tests are neither adding value to the assessments already in place, nor are wholly in line with the play-based philosophy and early years of the Curriculum for Excellence? Furthermore, in his speech to the SNP conference, the Cabinet Secretary called the opposition parties a disgrace on this issue because he asserted that we had used only political opportunism rather than the educational arguments about the whole issue. So can I ask the Cabinet Secretary, does he also believe that those Primary 1 teachers and those members of the public and parents who are opposing these tests are also a disgrace and guilty of political opportunism? And finally, can I ask the Cabinet Secretary again, if he is now agreeing that there is need for an independent review, exactly what evidence was it that convinced him that 4- and 5-year-olds in Scotland needed to be tested in this way when many high-performing education systems don't consider such tests as either necessary or educationally beneficial?
Cabinet Secretary.
So there are a number of points in there that I will need to take time to deal with. First of all, I do believe the will of Parliament is important, and I'm trying to address the will of Parliament. And what I've set out in my statement today is how I intend to respect the will of Parliament by addressing the different components of the motion that Liz Smith herself authored and put forward, one element of which was to reconsider the evidence. And I am proposing to reconsider the evidence by instituting an independent review. So I am respecting the will of Parliament to do that. But what I have to be mindful of, and I am the only person in the chamber who has this duty, is to ensure that I don't act in a fashion that disrespects the educational performance and approaches that are put in place to support the needs of young people, the length and breadth of the country, because that's my duty as Education Secretary to do that. And when Liz Smith says, what evidence compelled me to believe that assessments of 4- and 5-year-olds should be undertaken, the custom and practice of 27 out of 32 local authorities in Scotland doing exactly that for many, many years without a word of objection was part of what I believed was important, but there was an important enhancement in the assessments that we've put in place, which was the ability to support teachers the length and breadth of the country by providing some advice on consistency of achievement of standards across the country, which was missing from the independent schemes taken forward by individual local authorities. Now, Liz Smith raised the comments that I made at my party conference, and I did describe the opposition parties as being guilty of political opportunism. I did that specifically to the Conservatives. And I went through in the parliamentary debate precisely why I felt that was political opportunism, because the Conservatives had tried to create an impression that at no stage they had ever supported P1 assessments, when in fact they had done so. And that was why I said those things. But what I'm trying to do today is to move us on from that political debate and concentrate on the educational arguments, which is the duty of all members of Parliament to focus on these questions.
Ian Gray to be followed by Ross Greer.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and my thanks too to the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement. The Cabinet Secretary says that he wishes to respect the Parliament's will. But, Presiding Officer, that is just not true. The intent of the motion passed and the will of this Parliament could not be clearer. It is that the national tests stop in Primary 1. This whole statement was a justification for refusing to respect the motion and defying this Parliament. The Cabinet Secretary demands that we focus on educational needs. Well, that is exactly what we did in reaching the conclusion that we did a month ago. Parliament listened to teachers, parents and the educational arguments and voted accordingly. Mr Swinney's problem is that he lost those educational arguments. It is the politics of the Cabinet Secretary's denial, his stubbornness and his hubris which must be set aside here. What on earth gives him the right to defy this Parliament?
Cabinet Secretary.
I think when Mr Gray uses the language that he uses, he betrays what is at the heart of his agenda here, which is the politics of all of this. And that is all that Mr Gray is interested in, is that Mr Gray is only interested in the politics of all of this. And Mr Gray cannot marshal universal educational opinion to support the argument that, and Mr Gray says, neither can I, and I'm acknowledging that, and I have acknowledged that throughout this process, which is why
it's not a conversation, Mr Gray, please.
Which is why I am putting in place an independent review to consider the issues and to do as Mr Gray voted for in the parliamentary motion, to reconsider the evidence. Now, if Mr Gray had objected to that, Mr Gray shouldn't have put that in the motion. He shouldn't have co-authored it. He shouldn't have co-authored it with Liz Smith. He should have accepted.
Mr Gray, Ms Lamont, please.
If Mr Gray wanted to stop the tests and not raise the issue of reconsidering the evidence, he should have put a motion to Parliament to that effect. But he didn't do that. He was so interested in getting a cobbled-together political deal with the Tories. That was what he signed up to. And I'm simply pursuing what Parliament put in place. But what I'm not prepared to do which Mr Gray appears to be prepared to do, is to act in a fruitless fashion with the educational well-being of children. I will not do that for political convenience, which is what Mr Gray signed up to in the parliamentary debate.
Ross Greer, to be followed by Tavish Scott. Ross Greer.
Thank you. Can I thank the Deputy First Minister for advance copy of his statement and remind him that some of us have held a consistent position against the testing of young children before it became standardised nationally. But can I ask him if, in the course of this review, all options, including continuous formative assessment, rather than formalised whether it's standardised nationally or not, will be put on the table? And can I also ask, what right does the Deputy First Minister think he has to pick and choose when he respects the will of Parliament?
Deputy First Minister.
First of all, can I say to Mr Greer, he's absolutely correct that the Green Party has had a consistent position of opposition to these assessments, and I acknowledge that, as I have done on previous occasions. But Mr Greer then goes on to engage in the issues that I have put forward in a constructive way about what might be the content of the review that we undertake. And I'm perfectly willing to embrace the points that he makes, because I think they're reasonable points to add into the remit, so that we can have a considered view about these questions. Because fundamentally, what I said and what I acknowledged in my statement was that the independent review could end up saying, with these changes, P1 assessment should continue, but equally, the review could say, it doesn't matter what you do, P1 assessment should stop. And I've accepted that that may well be the outcome of the review. What I'm simply saying is that Parliament asked me, as part of the motion, to reconsider the evidence, and I'm putting in place a mechanism to enable Parliament to do that in a way that we can have a considered discussion about this, bearing in mind the issues that Mr Greer has raised, which help us to advance the educational debate on all of these points in the period going forward. And I think that would be to the benefit of Scottish education.
Tavish Scott, to be followed by Gil Ross.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I thank the Deputy First Minister for his statement as well. The review he's mentioned before was, of course, steered by Education Scotland, and they were the unequivocal backers of testing of 4- and 5-year-old boys and girls in Primary 1. So what will be different this time? And in the meantime, tens of thousands of those 4- and 5-year-old girls and boys in Primary 1 will continue to be tested through the remainder of 2019. What bit of halt doesn't the government understand?
Cabinet Secretary.
The first point I'd say to Mr Scott, and I may not have made this expressly clear, the review will not be carried out by Education Scotland. It will be carried out independently of Government and Education Scotland. I will take advice from the Chief Inspector of Education about who should take forward that review, but as I've indicated in my statement, I'm very welcome to discuss those questions with other parties within Parliament to secure broad agreement about how we might take forward these issues. And Mr Greer has suggested elements that could be enhanced about the remit. I welcome that. I welcome input from other members of Parliament as to how we might do that and how we might take forward this approach to command as broad support as we possibly can do, so that we do this on an evidence basis to ensure that we come to the correct conclusions. The second point that Mr Scott raised was in relation to the involvement of P1 pupils in this school year in these assessments. And I believe there is a justification for maintaining that position to give us further evidence to consider as part of the evidence review, but also to acknowledge the fact that these assessments have been going on within Scottish schools in 27 out of 32 local authority areas for many, many years. And it helps to structure the assessment of young people's performance and to enhance the learning that they undertake. That's the whole purpose of assessment for learning, which is exactly what the approach that I'm setting out is designed to address.
Gail Ross, to be followed by Alison Harris.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary outline what support the Scottish Government is giving the teachers that are currently administering the assessments?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, there has been a variety of training and briefing events made available to individual teachers. We obviously have taken into account some of the feedback from the first year of implementation, which has then changed practice for the deployment of the standardised assessments in this school year. We will continue to offer that, and we're obviously establishing the P1 Practitioners Forum, which will enable Primary 1 practitioners to feed back directly to the Government and to the Scottish National Standardised Assessment team the various practical and operational issues which arise out of the administration of these assessments. So the Government provides that support in schools, but clearly we're also listening intently to the feedback from individual practitioners about their experience in taking forward these assessments.
Alison Harris, to be followed by Claire Adamson.
Thank you. The Parliament voted to scrap P1 tests. The Deputy First Minister was adamant that we in Parliament were wrong. Now he's commissioned a lengthy review, and on page 5 says in his statement, P1 assessments should be reformed, not abolished. Or alternatively, the review might say that the outcome is that these assessments have to be stopped. Have you, Cabinet Secretary, already decided that parts of these assessments need to be reformed, and exactly how much will this review cost?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I already introduced a number of changes to the second year of standardised assessments for 2018-19 based on the feedback that we'd had from the previous year from practitioners. So I've remained open to making sure that we address these issues. And as the President of the Association of Directors of Education stated, we need to enable time to be given to see what the experience is involved in taking forward measures of this type. And so the Government will remain, as I answered Gail Ross a moment ago, very open to understanding that feedback from individuals. Now, in relation to the cost of the review, obviously, we will look very carefully at the management of costs of an individual review. But what I would say to Alison Harris is that if we are going to take steps that will have an effect on the learning of young people within our education system, we must be prepared to invest in the research processes to enable that to happen. That's what the Government does ordinarily. That's what we will do in this particular case. And I will, of course, report fully to Parliament on all costs involved.
Claire Adamson, to be followed by Joanne Lamond.
Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his statement and particularly welcome the review that he is putting in place. This has no doubt given the P1 assessments have given rise to competing considerations, those of the Parliament and of the obligation on every government to do what it thinks is in the best interests of its young people and its citizens. But does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that his decisions should be based on the most reliable information and the best examples from other countries to ensure that we're doing the right thing for the young people of Scotland?
Cabinet Secretary.
That has been the consideration in my mind, Presiding Officer, because I could have come here and said that we're going to do nothing about this. I could have said we're not going to have an independent review at all. But I've come here and accepted that I'm instituting a process that might result in evidence being marshalled that says we shouldn't proceed with P1 assessments. But what I'm trying to persuade Parliament of is the importance of taking an evidence-based approach to this whole question. I think that was lacking from the debate that we had earlier on. There is competing evidence on this question, and I want to have that considered independently so that at no stage are we taking a decision that could be in any way damaging to the educational well-being of children and young people in our society.
Joanne Lamond, to be followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I say gently to the Cabinet Secretary that it may be a comfort zone for him to impugn the motives of people who raise these issues, but genuinely, people who are concerned about these questions are concerned because they care about the education of our young people, and it doesn't do you or anyone else any service to suggest that people's motives are anything other than that. But can I ask on the specifics? On the 21st of June, the First Minister said, quote, "As a result of the introduction of standardised assessment and the new way in which we are monitoring performance instead of the previous Scottish survey of literacy and numeracy data, we will now have data on every pupil in the country which will allow us to determine progress in reducing the attainment gap." The Education Secretary today says this is not the purpose of these tests. So, is it the First Minister or the Deputy First Minister who is wrong? Because self-evidently they cannot both be right.
Cabinet Secretary.
John Lamont frequently accuses me of impugning people's motives, and maybe I have to look at how I communicate about some of these questions. But I don't impugn the motives of teachers that come to me and say they don't like them. Equally, I don't impugn the motives of teachers that come to me and say they are essential. Because these are points of view which I have heard, and Joanne Lamont will have heard them as well, and if she's not, then I don't think she's listening to all sides of the debate, because all of them, the evidence is marshalled, which shows that is, those are competing points of view. if I have impugned anyone's motives, I've impugned the motives of the Conservatives, because I think because they have behaved politically in a very, in my view, in an utterly inconsistent fashion on this question. But that's so. I'm owning up to impugning the motives of the Conservatives, but nobody else in this debate. I might take a different perspective in the debate, which is why I'm commissioning an independent review of the process. And in my statement, to answer the second part of Joanne Lamont's question, I made it expressly clear that standardised assessments form part of the overall judgment that is made by individual teachers of whether young people are reaching the levels in curriculum for excellence. That is what the purpose of standardised assessments are used for. And the point the First Minister was making in the quote that Joanne Lamont cited is that what the standardised assessments enable us to do is to support the achievement of consistency or reflecting consistency in assessment across the country, which is not possible within the individual compartmentalised assessments that are undertaken in each individual local authority area.
Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary set out what advice was sought by Aberdeen City Council from Education Scotland regarding their decision to halt national P1 testing, as according to a recent FOI, they have received no representations from parents to halt the tests and previously had their own P1 tests? And does this not represent a cynical move by the current administration in Aberdeen City to jump on an SNP bad political bandwagon, which is to the detriment of pupils and their parents?
Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I'm not aware of any advice that Aberdeen City Council has sought from Education Scotland, and I wouldn't ordinarily be aware of that point because Education Scotland operates independently from government. But on the substantive point that Maureen Watt raises, I did hear a representative of the leadership of Aberdeen City Council being interviewed on the radio, who was making the argument against P1 assessments and was rather uncomfortably had the point put to him by the interviewer that Aberdeen City Council had been running P1 assessments for many years, and the individual concerned didn't seem to have considered the implications of that particular stance. So what I urge Parliament to do, what I urge local authorities to do, is to participate in this exercise, to do this consideration of the evidence as effectively as we possibly can do, independently of this process, and come to an evidence-based conclusion about what is right for the assessment of primary 1 pupils in Scotland.
Thank you, and apologies to the 4 members I couldn't call: Michelle Ballantyne, John Mason, Daniel Johnson and Gillian Martin, but there is not enough time this afternoon, I'm afraid. We have a number of statements to get through. We move on to the next item of business, which is a statement from the Cabinet Secretary Humza Yousaf on home detention curfews. We'll just take a few seconds, or as little time as possible, for members and ministers to change seats.
The next item of business is a statement by Humza Yousaf on home detention curfew, HMIPS and HMICS independent review. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Humza Yousaf for up to 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. I would like to begin by expressing my sincere condolences to Craig McClelland's family. I met with them again this morning to discuss these reports and how the government will respond. And it's clear from our conversations that Craig was a much-loved son, a much-loved brother, partner, and most of all, dad to his 3 boys. Craig was a remarkable young man. Through speaking to his family, I've heard much more about him. I heard stories of Craig's selflessness, how he would intervene if somebody was in danger without giving consideration to himself. But what touched me the most, perhaps, was how Craig's life completely revolved around his family and friends, and especially Stacey and his 3 boys. I would like to commend his family, Craig's family, for their bravery and also, of course, their tenacity in highlighting their concerns about the circumstances of Craig's death. I am absolutely determined that lessons will be learned and that improvements will be made to home detention curfew to ensure that public safety remains absolutely paramount. In June, my predecessor instructed HMIPS and HMICS to undertake independent reviews of HDC. Those reports have been laid in Parliament today. I met with the 2 chief inspectors yesterday, and I would like to thank them and their teams for undertaking these reviews. I also met with the Chief Executive of the Scottish Prison Service and with the Chief Constable this week to seek assurances that the Inspectorate's findings will be addressed as a priority. Presiding Officer, I will discuss the Inspectorate's findings and the action being taken in response in just a moment. Before I do, I'd like to provide some context, overall context of HDC. Home detention curfew is an established mechanism for preparing prisoners for release. It is not available to all prisoners and is not an entitlement. Prisoners are only eligible following risk assessment and provided that they are not subject to statutory exclusions. At any time, there are around 300 people on HDC. This is approximately 4% of the prison population and is comparable to its use in England and Wales. Since it was introduced in 2006, over 20,000 people have been released under HDC. The vast majority, 80%, successfully complete their period of HDC. Of those who are recalled, the vast majority are returned promptly to custody. However, I am clear that HDC needs to be strengthened in light of the Inspectorate's findings. The Inspectorate's reviews examine the process for assessing whether someone should be placed on HDC and for investigating breaches and apprehending individuals following recall. The reviews also examined whether processes were followed in the case of James Wright, who was convicted of Craig's murder. In this specific case, the Inspectorate found that the application process and decisions to release were in line with existing policies and guidance. However, there were some oversights. They were clear that the assessment process should be improved. The Inspectorates found that once the recall order for James Wright was issued, police delivered the necessary briefings and updated their systems appropriately. However, they noted that there was a lack of a documented approach and effective oversight in the efforts to apprehend James Wright. It is clear, therefore, that improvements are absolutely needed, and I intend to take immediate action. Presiding Officer, I'd like to make clear at the outset that SPS, Police Scotland and indeed the Scottish Government will accept all of the Inspectorate's recommendations. The Chief Executive of the Prison Service and the Chief Constable have given me assurances that, in addition to actions already taken, work to implement the recommendations are being taken forward as a top priority. It is not possible in the time allotted, Presiding Officer, to discuss all of the recommendations in detail today. I will, however, highlight the main findings common to both reports and set out the immediate actions being taken to address them. In terms of the risk assessment, both reviews were clear that the risk assessment process should be strengthened to make decision-making procedures more robust. Specifically, the Inspectorates recommend that there should be greater consideration of the potential risk an individual may pose to the community, improved access to police intelligence to inform decisions, improved support and guidance for staff undertaking assessments, and crucially, a presumption of refusal of home detention curfew where the individual's offence involves certain prior behaviours. In response, the following additional safeguards are being implemented. There will be a presumption that individuals whose offence involves violence or knife crime will not, in normal circumstances, receive home detention curfew, and we will consider the option of placing this on a statutory basis. We will also look at exclusions for individuals who have known links to serious and organised crime. Police intelligence is now being shared to inform decisions about HDC release, and SPS are adding an additional level of assurance to the HDC assessment process. Governors in charge will now receive recommendations and will decide on HDC release, applying consistent criteria. Alongside this, SPS and partners will review the assessment criteria for HDC and will make any necessary wider improvements. In relation to the governance and procedure, the inspectorates also identified that improvements were needed to ensure greater consistency in HDC processes and to strengthen governance. In response, SPS and Police Scotland are improving the consistency of documentation relating to HDC as a priority. Police Scotland has also taken action to strengthen the governance of activity to apprehend individuals who are unlawfully at large. These individuals are now discussed at each local area commander's daily tactical briefing, ensuring clear tasking and supervision arrangements are in place. Presiding Officer, both inspectorates highlighted shortcomings in the information sharing processes between SPS and Police Scotland in relation to HDC, particularly the status of those who are unlawfully at large. Police Scotland and SPS have already undertaken urgent work to rectify this. In June, they established a working group to review and improve their information sharing and communication processes in relation to HDC. As a result, they now have clear communication processes in place so that information on individuals released on HDC and those subject to recall notices is shared and acted on in real time. This means that efforts can be focused on identifying and apprehending individuals who are unlawfully at large. Consequently, the number of individuals who are unlawfully at large from HDC has decreased from 54 on the 18th of June to 8 as of this morning. The inspectorates found that cross-border arrangements where individuals are released to addresses in England and Wales should be a lot clearer, particularly in relation to notification on release and revocation of HDC licences. SPS and Police Scotland have already taken action on this. They have established single points of contact in all 43 police forces in England and Wales, and have developed clear processes to alert those forces in HMPPS to release on HDC to a curfew address in their area and any revocation of those licences. As a further safeguard, Police Scotland are also informed and confirm that the relevant information is logged on the Police National Computer. Presiding Officer, as part of their review, HMICS examined the powers available to Police Scotland to apprehend individuals who remain unlawfully at large. Consequently, they have recommended that government considers making remaining unlawfully at large a specific offence. This would also provide associated powers of entry for the police. I accept this recommendation and will consult with criminal justice partners and of course those across the chamber on the best way forward. If they agree with this proposal, this will be taken forward by way of a Stage 2 amendment to the current Management of Offenders Bill scheduled for spring 2019. Presiding Officer, I believe that these additional safeguards will strengthen HDC processes in the immediate term by delivering more robust and consistent assessment, improved governance and oversight of release decisions and in relation to apprehension, streamlined communication between SPS and Police Scotland, and clearer cross-border arrangements. These immediate actions form part of a wider programme of work to implement all the Inspectorate's recommendations. I have made clear to the Chief Executive of SPS and the Chief Constable that I expect to see real and demonstrable progress, and I have made it clear to them that the Scottish Government will, of course, do likewise. Police Scotland and the Prison Service have established a senior strategic oversight group to drive forward this work. The group involves and includes representation from other criminal justice partners and indeed the Scottish Government, and will report on their progress directly to the Chief Constable and the Chief Executive of SPS. I've asked the Chair of the SPA to maintain oversight of Police Scotland's activity to implement the recommendations for the police, and I've also asked HMIPS and HMICS to review progress against their own recommendations in 6 months. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I believe that the immediate actions I've set out today, along with the work SPS and Police Scotland are undertaking, will make HDC processes more robust and will help to strike a balance between support for reintegration and the requirement to protect public safety. I'd like to close by reiterating my thanks to Craig McClelland's family for their determination in raising their concerns about the operation of HDC. It is through their tenacity, their tireless campaigning on behalf of Craig that we have got to this point. I want to thank them sincerely for their efforts, as their campaigning means we will have a stronger, more robust HDC regime. Ensuring the voices of victims and their families are heard throughout the justice system is a top priority for me and this government. I will continue to keep Craig's family and this Parliament updated on progress.
The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised. I intend to allow around 20 minutes and then we'll move on. Would those who wish to ask a question press the request to speak buttons, please? We're already over time, so I would ask you to bear brevity in mind. And the first question to Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. Can I too praise the family of Craig McClelland for their bravery and determination in pursuing this matter. But ultimately, this has been a catastrophic failure of the justice system to protect the public. The McClelland family and the public will be rightly asking why on earth tragedy had to strike in order for the SNP government to investigate and ultimately make these changes. For example, and I'm sure the Cabinet Secretary will agree, it beggars belief that the prison service and the police were not already sharing information on offenders unlawfully at large. Now, firstly, he boasts that 80% of those on HDCs complete them. That is a failure rate of 1 in 5. So I ask, first of all, is the Cabinet Secretary really happy with that failure rate? And secondly, this Cabinet Secretary has pledged to strengthen victims' rights, but there is not a single recommendation in here to do that. He knows well the Michel's Law campaign demands, but there is no commitment to any of those in this statement. And I ask simply why, and ask perhaps that he put those commitments in. And finally, there were concerns raised in June that the police do not have the necessary powers to force entry to property in cases of breach of HDC or entry to property when criminals are unlawfully at large. So why is there nothing in this statement addressing those concerns? And what will the Cabinet Secretary be doing to address this? Thank you.
Hamza Youssef.
Can I thank Liam Kerr for his questions? To answer his question directly, no, of course I'm not happy that 80% complete and only 80%. I just think the context of that is hugely important. Yes, I think there's some reflection to be done around those 20%. Should we be putting targets on to reduce that 20%, I think is a sensible suggestion, and let me reflect on that suggestion. So no, I'm not happy, but at the same time, looking and delving deeper into those 20%, the vast majority of those who don't complete their HDC are recalled back, or indeed their technical breaches for not being at the right place at the right time. They do not, the majority of those 20% do not go on to commit grave and serious crimes while unlawfully at large. But that is no comfort at all to the McClelland family, and that is completely understandable. So I think his point is well made, and I just say very clearly, no, I'm not happy at that, but the context is important. He asked me about Michel's Law. Can I maybe just go back to him to say that I find often that Liam Kerr might do this, and it may well be inadvertent, but he is confusing and conflating two separate issues. Michel's Law is largely to do with parole, the issues around parole, and then what happens thereafter in relation to release on licence. The issue we are focusing on today is home detention curfew. So why would I make a statement about parole during a statement on home detention curfew? I'm not convinced, but I'm happy to take that offline. But to give you some comfort on the Michel's Law campaign, when I've met with the Stewart family and indeed with Liam Kerr on this, I have sympathy for every single one of their three major asks, and as part of the review in parole, which the First Minister agreed to during the programme for government, we will explore every single one of their asks. Some of them I don't think need legislation, but some of them may well do, so I can commit to that. In terms of my statement, I did address the issues around power of entry. I'm sorry if it wasn't clear enough, but I'll reiterate it, which was that one of the recommendations from the Inspectorate was making going unlawfully at large an offence. If we do that through perhaps a stage 2 amendment, the Management of Offenders Bill, that will give police the powers of entry that they require, and that is something that the family raised with me this morning, and I'm happy to commit to.
Daniel Johnson.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and can I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of the statement.
But I'd also like to offer my sincere condolences to the family of Craig McClelland. I know that these reports will answer some of the questions they have about Craig's murder, but I do hope that the government will commit to doing whatever it takes to go beyond these reports to answer the remaining questions that the family will have. Because let's be clear, this is a murder that's not one that just shouldn't have happened. It shouldn't have been possible. These reports detail multiple failings. There are clear recommendations for both the prison service and the police. So I would begin by welcoming and that we will back the government's commitment to give additional powers to the police to deal with those who have breached home detention curfews, which we indeed called for this summer. But the timeline of events leading to Craig's murder show that while the SPS had revoked the home detention curfew on the 24th of February, it took until the 4th of May until an address check was carried out by the police. That is truly shocking. Does the Cabinet Secretary accept that when HDCs are revoked, the police must treat this with the priority it deserves and have the resources to match? But more importantly, the Cabinet Secretary's remarks point to interagency working and process. My concern is that the multiple failings detailed here point to much larger and widespread issues within the agencies themselves. They point to competence and capacity issues of those agencies, not just how they work together. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with that? And given all the failings that were detailed in these reports, and indeed the 24 people who've remained at large for more than 4 years, why has it taken a tragic murder for the government to investigate the issues that have been revealed?
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank Daniel Johnson for his questions? I'll try to go through as many of them as I possibly can. In relation to the family's request for more answers, more questions to be answered, I met with them this morning. We had a lengthy meeting, understandably so, for the McClelland family. Most of their questions surrounded Craig's tragic murder. What I said to them was that they should reflect on the reports that will be published at 12:30, and if they would like a further follow-up meeting with me, then they are most welcome to have that meeting, and I will meet with them. They will meet with the police and have access to the police and also with the Scottish Prison Service if they wish. And my understanding is they're meeting with police on Monday next week, and then something being arranged with SPS too. So my door very much is open to the McClelland family to do what I can to get to the answers to the specific questions. In relation to the actual incident itself, in some respects, Daniel Johnson is absolutely right, of course. The McClelland family told me that at the time of Craig's murder, people would come up to them to say, oh, it's a shame Craig was in the wrong place at the wrong time. That is nonsense. James Wright was in the wrong place at the wrong time. Craig had every right to go from his house to his mother's house and expect to get there absolutely safely. And so he's absolutely right. There were some failings in that case. Some of them have been absolutely identified in the Inspectorate's reports around documentation, governance, communication, and that is why we will accept all of those recommendations, as will SPS and Police Scotland. In relation to moving forward and competency of organisations, that is why I have instructed, after 6 months, a review to take place on the recommendations, because I want to be absolutely assured, I want to be filled with absolute confidence that these recommendations are being acted on, and I've seen that through the Short Life Working Group. And I look forward to seeing that review in 6 months' time. In terms of priority, I agree with his assessment, and the Inspectorate's clearly highlighted that in both their reports. Going unlawfully at large, somebody going unlawfully at large must be given greater priority, and I'm confident that the recommendations, if accepted, will help to move that priority further up the agenda.
Can I say that the opening questions and answers have taken much longer than they should, and that will penalise backbenchers. I certainly won't get all the questions in, as many as possible if people are brief, if possible. George Adam, followed by Margaret Mitchell.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Craig McClelland was a young man who met the love of his life and had 3 lovely boys, dedicated to his young family and his partner Stacey, loved by all his family. He's more than the tragic story that we have before us today. Today, Craig's family and myself met with the Cabinet Secretary to discuss both reports, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for confirming that this dialogue will continue. These are tragic circumstances, and none of us can bring Craig back. But what we can do, and what the family want to know, is how we protect others from going through the same grief. Can the Cabinet Secretary tell me how we can take these recommendations and ensure that no other families have to endure this heartbreak? Can he explain how we translate these recommendations into legislation and what form that might take?
Hamza Yousaf.
Can I thank George Adam for accompanying the family on the many occasions. I know publicly that they've had to have various meetings with various public agencies and indeed meetings with myself. I know he's been a great supporter of the family and to get the answers that they absolutely deserve. In relation to directly answering his questions, I think I highlighted in my statement that there's a potential to bring forward a Stage 2 amendment of the Management of Offenders Bill. We will explore that with members of this chamber, of course, but also with other stakeholders, if that is the most appropriate and quickest way of bringing that offence and that change in legislation forward. Information sharing was also one of the key themes of both reports, and I can confirm that the working group, the oversight group, will continue the work of the working group as it was to ensure that SPS and Police Scotland have continued good sharing of information, but also good governance. And I think the other and the last point I'll make is that the exclusion and non-eligibility of those who are in prison for violence or indeed carrying a knife and potentially for the links to serious organised crimes is something that we will take forward very much as quickly as we possibly can. I think practically that can be done relatively quickly as a presumption, and hopefully relatively quickly on a statutory basis too.
Margaret Mitchell, followed by Neil Bibby.
Thank you. The review says that the assessment process should be improved, for example, by giving improved access to police intelligence to inform decision. It also highlights shortcomings in communication and information sharing between SPS and Police Scotland, particularly regarding the status of those unlawfully at large. Can the Cabinet Secretary confirm if either or both of these issues or any of its other recommendations have a direct bearing on the Chief Constable's call for the 300 million funding for what he describes as the vital new IT project to support and ensure that Police Scotland can get on with doing its job?
Hamza Yousaf.
Yeah, thank Margaret Mitchell. I think it's a very good question. I don't think it does have bearing in that the police are now starting to share that information, that intelligence very closely now with SPS. There doesn't seem to be a block because of the IT. That doesn't seem to be a stumbling block if that's a direct question, but when I was in front of our committee, of course, I did say that I understood the importance of the ICT proposal from Police Scotland. I'm sympathetic, but it will undoubtedly come down to questions of affordability. But on her specific question, no, I don't think it has a bearing on that, certainly not from what I've seen. And the police tell me they can act on those recommendations and act on those relatively quickly.
Neil Bibby, followed by John Finney.
The murder of Craig McClelland has shocked and horrified my community. Having met with Craig's family and spoken with his father earlier today, it's impossible not to be moved by their strength, their dignity or their determination to get the answers they deserve. Like the Cabinet Secretary, Craig's father told me that someone said his son was in the wrong place at the wrong time, yet he had every right to be there in his own community. The man convicted of his murder did not. I welcome these reports, but it's clear for the family there are still many unanswered questions. Why was locating this offender not a priority? Why was this murder assessed to be low risk? Why has the system so dramatically failed? To be absolutely clear, will the Justice Secretary give a public commitment today to work with the family to find the answers they need and the truth they seek?
Hamza Yousaf.
Very simply, yes, I will, and I gave that commitment to the family. I'm more than happy to speak, of course, to Neil Bibby as well, if he wishes, about some of the actions that we'll take forward. What I've asked the family to do is take away the reports. They are, as you can imagine, lengthy reports. I'm sure he's seen them, to digest those reports and to come back to me if they want to have further meetings with me. Equally, they're having meetings with the police and meetings with, I understand, the Scottish Prison Service as well. So there may well be many questions that they still feel need answered. I'm more than happy to work with the family to do my best to get them. In terms of the risk assessment that he mentions, that is a key theme right throughout both reports. The fact that the risk assessment should give higher priority to whether or not public safety could be compromised or affected by somebody going on HTC is a very welcome recommendation, I should say, in the reports, one that all of us, all the partners, but particularly, of course, in this case, SPS, will take forward immediately.
John Finney, followed by Liam MacArthur.
Thank you, President Officer. I thank the Cabinet Secretary for his sight to the report, and the thoughts, of course, are with Craig's family and friends. A precautionary principle should apply, Cabinet Secretary, and had it, we wouldn't have this failing. I welcome your making remaining unlawfully at large a specific offence, and there are complexities about that because, of course, the report talks about people at large out with our jurisdiction. But within this jurisdiction, can you give an assurance that when bringing forward that amendment at stage 2, you will not intend granting the power of arrest or the power of entry to any private company which may be monitoring the home detention scheme, please?
Yes, I mean, I'm in the same vein of thinking as John Finney, but clearly bringing forward legislation, be it through a Stage 2 amendment or otherwise, it will give us the opportunity to discuss these issues at great detail, great length. But I have to say, my gut certainly is in the same place as John Finney's here. Making it an offence within legislation should mean that it should be the police that are apprehending, arresting, or indeed having the power of entry when somebody goes unlawfully at large.
Liam MacArthur, followed by Ruth Maguire.
Can I too thank the Cabinet Secretary for early sight of his statement, and on behalf of the Scottish Liberal Democrats pay tribute to Craig McClelland's family for their determination that their tragic loss should lead to improvements in our system of HTC. The Inspectorate's reports highlight the failures in HTC and the extent to which those illegally at large were off the radar of police and the prison service. In that context, can the Cabinet Secretary outline the specific steps being taken to address what appears to be a patchwork of IT systems operated by the police and prison services that does appear to have contributed to this shocking and needless tragedy?
Hamza Yousaf.
I would say to Liam MacArthur, similar to my answer to Margaret Mitchell's questions, is that it doesn't make it clear that the necessarily IT was the issue, but basic information should be shared, and I think will contribute to making our HDC system and processes more robust. Where there is an IT block to that, then yes, of course, that discussion needs to take place. That I've mentioned already my understanding of the proposals from Police Scotland to improve their ICT systems. But in this case, sharing information, even at a most basic level, could strengthen and would strengthen the HDC system, HCC regime. But that does not require, I don't think, an upgrade in IT systems, unless I'm told otherwise, by SPS or indeed by Police Scotland. But if that is the case, then of course I will have those discussions with my partner agencies.
Ruth Maguire, followed by Maurice Corey.
Presiding Officer, the Scottish Government and indeed the Cabinet Secretary have committed to developing a victim-centred approach across the criminal justice system. Can I ask the Cabinet Secretary how changes being proposed to the home detention curfew fit in with this very important commitment?
Hamza Yousaf.
Thanks, Ruth Maguire, for that. In my discussions with Craig McClelland's family this morning, I mentioned the victims task force which I will set up, and I've importantly said that victims and the families of victims' input into that task force will be incredibly important, and I've invited them, the McClelland family, to send representatives as part of that discussion. And I think what we're doing on HDC is absolutely vital and important to that work, but equally the McClelland family mentioned to me what they thought were a number of gaps within the entire criminal justice system from the moment that terrible tragedy happened to even more recently than that. And I think we owe it to the victims to make sure that their rights are absolutely strengthened. And of course, the Victims Task Force will absolutely be a part of that. And I go back to my answer to Neil Bibby's question, that the risk assessment process will also be really, really important in this sense for the victim, because it will be around public safety being given a greater emphasis within that risk assessment process, hopefully giving the public more reassurance and more confidence on HDC.
The last question goes to Maurice Corey.
Secretary commit today to supporting an amendment to the Management of Offenders Bill to make breaching a tagging order an automatic offence, as indeed the Scottish Women's Aid have called for recently?
Hamza Yousaf.
Yes, I think I've answered that in a couple of ways in my statement, but also from questions from others. I'm more than happy to look at that as a proposal. We'll consider that with members of the Chamber here, but also consider it with stakeholder organisations like Scottish Women's Aid and many others. But I'm more than happy to listen to Maurice Corey's suggestions and feedback and other members' feedback on that suggestion, whatever is the quickest way and the most appropriate way to bring an offence of going unlawfully at large forward. I will do that.
I'm sorry I've been unable to call Jackie Bailey, Willie Coffey, Rona Mackay and John Mason, but we must close questions in this statement and move on to the next item of business. We appear to have a problem with the microphone in the middle seat on the front row. So if I could ask the Cabinet Secretary to shift along to his right or left, that would be useful. No, sorry, I was just checking you were okay. You don't. Very pleased you're fine. The next item of business is a statement by Michael Russell on Scotland's place in Europe, our way forward. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions at the end of his statement, and so there should be no interventions or interruptions. And I call on Michael Russell. Up to 10 minutes, please, Cabinet Secretary.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to update Parliament today on the state of the Brexit negotiations and the steps the Scottish Government is taking to protect Scotland from the damage that leaving the EU will cause. Let me start by being clear. The premise of all my previous statements to the Chamber has been that there are ongoing negotiations of substance and that the UK Government is working towards a plan. I am no longer confident that that is the case. On the withdrawal agreement, which is supposed to be the easier part of the negotiations, it's now clear that UK Government ministers are incapable of reaching agreement, even within their own party, on the crucial issue of the Northern Ireland backstop. So with just weeks to go before an agreement needs to be signed, the UK Government does not have a coherent or unified position that it can put before the European Union. Put bluntly, Presiding Officer, the UK Government has no plan, and no plan to get a plan. On the future relationship, which even if a withdrawal agreement is made, will be subject to probably years of difficult negotiations, again, there is no UK Government position worthy of the name. The Chequers proposals have been rejected by the EU and are under attack from all sides. It's time to face the reality that without something new and some means of the Tory party setting aside its internecine warfare, then we are heading to a disastrous no deal. But there is, of course, one credible plan on the table. That is the plan from the Scottish Government, which we have been advocating since the publication of the first part of Scotland's place in Europe in December 2016, and which continues to attract support. Presiding Officer, on October the 15th this year, the Scottish Government published Scotland's place in Europe, Our Way Forward, updating the case if the best solution of staying in the EU is not possible for both the UK and Scotland to remain in the single market and the customs union. Later in that week, the European Council broke up without concluding either a withdrawal agreement or a political declaration on the future relationship. We are therefore at the brink of that catastrophic no deal. Yet meanwhile, we have tragedy turning to farce, even in this chamber, with the spectacle of the leader of the Scottish Conservatives and the Secretary of State for Scotland threatening to resign if a Northern Ireland backstop is agreed, in case that strengthened the case for Scotland staying in the single market. To go out, Presiding Officer, on the principle that Scotland must be guaranteed a worse deal than that which could be and should be on offer. What this country deserves is a clearly articulated plan. Scotland deserves a plan which is evidence-based and objective, a plan that provides a firm basis for fruitful negotiations with our European partners, and most importantly of all, a plan that will protect jobs, living standards and rights in our society. The Scottish Government has repeatedly and with constantly increasing detail set out just such a plan, one that could and would solve the current impasse in the negotiations, providing a basis for compromise. Our plan would remove the political difficulties with the EU and provide a secure foundation for negotiations in the critical coming weeks. It would reassure business as they reluctantly start to make investment decisions detrimental to our collective future. Indeed, the CBI set out as recently as yesterday that business optimism is falling at its fastest rate since the Brexit vote. So let me make clear what is required now. Before leaving, the UK Government needs to secure both an agreement on the terms of withdrawal and a political declaration that provides clarity on the future relationship. Both of which, of course, the Prime Minister said in her Lancaster House speech would be secured by late 2018. A small number of simple steps would allow for these difficulties to be resolved, simpler steps than the contortions put forward by the Prime Minister on Monday. The UK Government should revise its negotiating position on the future relationship to ensure that the whole of the UK remains within the European single market and the customs union. However, if the UK Government rejects this, it could seek an extension to the Article 50 period to allow for a consensus to be agreed across the UK, thereby avoiding a hurried and damaging exit. And if that proposal was rejected by the UK Government, then the political statement on the future relationship must be sufficiently detailed and any subsequent legislation sufficiently clear to allow the people of Scotland to understand the impact on their lives of the monumental decision to leave the European Union. The political statement should also provide clearly for an extension of the implementation period if needed. We must not be required to sign up to a blindfold Brexit. Our priority is to avoid the damage of either a no-deal Brexit or that blindfold Brexit, in which the UK leaves with no detail on the future economic partnership. Both of those outcomes will be disastrous for jobs and living standards. We are clear that the proposals made in the so-called Chequers Agreement will not work, and of course they have already been rejected. These issues can be resolved, however, through long-term membership of the European single market and of the customs union. So it is demonstrably wrong to say that there is no alternative to the Chequers proposal. It is the UK's government's position which is unsustainable, a position that insists on pursuing proposals which are not acceptable to the EU, or it would seem to the House of Commons, whilst rejecting a plan that is. There is no reason why our proposals cannot be accepted quickly, but if more time is needed to avoid a no-deal Brexit or blindfold Brexit, then the UK government should ask for an extension to the Article 50 process. This would also allow time for another referendum on EU membership, often called the People's Vote. The people of Scotland voted to remain, and therefore if there is an opportunity to ensure their wishes are respected, it should be taken. If a proposal was brought forward for a vote on the final deal with the option to remain in the EU, the Scottish Government would support it, and SNP members of Parliament would vote for it. But we must also find a way to ensure that any second referendum does not leave Scotland in the same position as in 2016, voting to stay, but ending up being taken out against our will. As I conclude, Presiding Officer, let me address three more issues briefly. Firstly, I believe some have chosen to misrepresent our position on Northern Ireland for their own divisive ends. We fully and unequivocally back the Good Friday Agreement and support the invisible border in Ireland, recognising the unique circumstances there. However, we have argued since 2016, since well before the backstop was even conceived, that the UK Government should be putting forward a differential deal reflecting our Remain vote if the UK were to leave the single market. That was and is independent from any Northern Ireland backstop. Our argument is given renewed force this week by the news that not only is such a differentiated deal likely for Northern Ireland, but that the deal has already been agreed for Gibraltar that maintains their differentiated treatment. It is now clear, contrary to the position of the UK Government in January 2017, that differentiation is not only possible, but actually the sensible way forward to reconcile differences. The truth is that it is only the intransigence of the UK Government that's preventing such a deal for Scotland. Rather than threatening to resign over securing such a deal, the Conservatives in this chamber and in this country should be fighting tooth and nail, not with each other, but for Scotland, to be given the respect that its voters and their decision deserves. Scotland should not be the only nation or territory which voted to remain within the EU, but which does not have the flexibility of a differentiated approach afforded to it. Secondly, let me confirm that intensive work on planning for a no deal is underway and growing in scope. Secondary legislation is now starting to flow through this Parliament, and I'm grateful for the work being undertaken by committees on it. Presently, that legislation consists of packets of statutory instruments agreed with the UK Government. Specific Scottish statutory instruments will come forward later this year and into the new year. The financial implications of a no deal for a government and the bodies supported by government is being carefully considered, and discussion with stakeholders like the ports is being undertaken. Senior officials are in close liaison with the UK Government. I intend to make a further statement to this chamber on the detail of no-deal preparations before the end of the year, or at the first moment we know that a no-deal would be inevitable. However, let me stress, Presiding Officer, that there are problems that will not be able to be overcome if, in the end, the chaos and irresponsibility of the Tories at Westminster leads to a no-deal outcome. The fact that they are talking of hiring boats, packing motorways with lorries and stockpiling medicines illustrates the vacuum in leadership in the UK, which is resulting in measures unprecedented in peacetime. That cannot be willed away by any of us. And finally, Presiding Officer, let me conclude with two specific commitments. With crucial decisions coming up over the next 2 weeks, it is vital to break the impasse. A decision to maintain membership of the European Single Market and the Customs Union would both secure a withdrawal agreement and provide the clarity needed for the future relationship. I can therefore say that if the UK government puts this option on the table, we will commit ourselves to support it. But without such a proposal, we reject every other option, short of staying in the EU, as all deliver not progress, but a succession of unacceptable and damaging bad deals, or ultimately no deal at all. However, I am also clear that it should not just be voices in Westminster who get to be heard, and especially not those who are determined to ignore the votes of Scotland and sell Scotland very short indeed in terms of our future prosperity. The UK were repeatedly told during the 2014 independence referendum that it was and must remain a partnership. Lead, don't leave, they said. But now the Tories say, we're the ones who are leading, we're the ones who are telling you, you're leaving. Your democratic choice doesn't matter. Well, it does. The government will never accept the silencing of Scotland. So if a withdrawal agreement and political declaration are in the end concluded and offered to the House of Commons, then we make this commitment. Before the Westminster Parliament votes on that deal, the Scottish Government will seek to ensure that this Parliament can pass its own judgment on it. On this most crucial of matters, Scotland must be and will be heard.
Cabinet Secretary will now take questions on the issues raised in the statement, and I'll allow around 20 minutes for that. Could you press your request to speak buttons, please? Anyone who wishes to ask a question, and I stress the word question rather than statements. And I call Murdo Fraser.
Officer, can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the advanced sight of his statement, although there is little in it we have not heard before. Indeed, all today's statement seems to be as another opportunity for yet more grandstanding and grievance from a minister who has become a master in both. The Cabinet Secretary tells us how catastrophic a no-deal scenario would be, but then astonishingly goes on to say that SNP MPs would bring on a no-deal scenario by voting against proposals brought forward by the UK Government. That's an irresponsible approach, Deputy Presiding Officer, and will be seen as such by the people of Scotland. And it seems extraordinary that we have a Cabinet Secretary in the Scottish Government who is unable to draw a distinction between arrangements for Gibraltar, a British territory with a tiny population, geographically situated thousands of miles away and attached to mainland Spain, and the very different situation in both Scotland and Northern Ireland, fully part of the United Kingdom. A differentiated deal for Scotland would put at risk the internal UK market, which is worth 4 times more to the Scottish economy than trade with the EU, a point which has been made by the likes of Sir David Edward and Lord Kerr, both members of the First Minister's own Standing Council on Europe. Will the Cabinet Secretary at last acknowledge this basic fact, that maintaining the UK internal market is of far greater importance to the Scottish economy than is the EU single market? And finally, on the issue of the so-called people's vote, is it really now the SNP position that all referendums must be rerun until they get the result that they want, or does that only apply to referendums where they are on the losing side?
Michael Russell.
The one thing, Presiding Officer, that never astonishes me is Murdo Fraser's brass neck. I mean, not so much brass as titanium lined, I have to say. The reality that we are in this situation, the reason we are in this situation, is because of the total and utter incompetence of the Tory party in government at Westminster. And indeed, that incompetence is matched now by the extraordinary, extreme, knee-jerk constitutional unionism of the Scottish Tories. They have nothing else to argue for. Meanwhile, Presiding Officer, Scotland is facing a unique and damaging crisis brought about by the Conservatives, and yet not a word of apology from Murdo Fraser. Instead, he pursues the old arguments and the old chimeras. I think that people like David Edward, I have to say, would be horrified to know that he was being called in evidence by extreme Tories to justify the destruction of the European Union and its institutions to which he has given many years of service. This is the disgraceful approach of the Tories. The reality is the Tories should hang their heads in shame rather than burble from the sidelines and make things worse for themselves.
Neil Finlay.
I'd like to thank the Cabinet Secretary for the copy of his statement. The Conservative Party's handling of Brexit has been a disaster. Now a matter of months from the date that the UK is due to leave the EU, and yet no one is any clearer in what has been proposed. The Prime Minister was humiliated at Salzburg, has been repeatedly humiliated by her own party. Chequers is dead, and her handling of this entire process has gone from neglect to dark, unfunny slapstick, because there's nothing funny about the stockpiling of foods and medicines. With only a few weeks to go until a deal must be agreed, businesses, communities and their citizens are in the dark about Tory plans. And on the very serious issue of the Northern Ireland border, they have no answer. Well, we do. We should have a customs union. That would resolve the problem. We should have single market access. We should protect the rights we've secured and that we enjoy. We should have a collaborative and cooperative relationship with our EU neighbours going forward. And we should have a deal that respects the nations and regions of the UK, ensuring the security and safety of our citizens. And we must have a migration system based on fairness. So the government is right to plan for a no-deal scenario. Indeed, it must plan for that, because that is the very scary prospect that we face. And I wonder if the Minister would give us a little more detail on what plans have been put in place for that. These are worrying times. We must keep all options open to keep the maximum political pressure upon the Government and the Prime Minister, and try to ensure that that no deal is completely avoided.
Michael Russell.
Yes, I'm happy to give you, I don't want to go into full detail because I do believe there is presently too much discussion of a no deal in a way that could make it actually more likely than not. I still think that the momentum is towards it, but I think we should do everything we can to hold it back. But I can say this, individual Cabinet Secretaries are now engaged in discussions both with me, with their stakeholders, and where possible through civil servants, with civil servants south of the border, to scope each of the issues that confront them. For example, and I'll give you one example that is very concerning. If there is to be a continuation of an export trade in both meat and shellfish, there will require to be inspections undertaken, phytosanitary inspections undertaken. There simply aren't enough people to undertake those who are qualified. How do we resolve that question? How can we actually put in place a system to do so? Now, that is the type of extremely difficult question which is being addressed. And I can assure the member that right across the portfolios, those questions are being scoped and are being looked at. Some are capable of resolution. For example, I mentioned ports. It would be conceivable if there was too much pressure on Dover to see Rosyth and Grangemouth, for example, brought into operation, although some major changes would be required. But there are some, as the one I've mentioned, which really it is very difficult to see how you could put a short-term solution in place. So we are scoping, we are working, and as I've said, I will come at the earliest possible moment to this chamber to try and outline further where we are. Can I make a point about customs union and single market access?
Quickly, please, Mr. Russell.
Sorry?
Quickly.
I'll make a point then simply about migration. The migration issue is crucial to Scotland, particularly to rural Scotland. And I am shocked that the UK government is still unable to discuss that in a constructive way with this government and the Welsh Labour government. Both Mark Drakeford and I made that point very forcibly at the JMC 2 weeks ago, and will go on making it.
Can I say the first two questions have gone well over their allotted time. That has an effect on backbench questions. I would ask backbenchers please to be quick to allow their colleagues an opportunity to ask. Joan McAlpin, followed by Maurice Golden.
Thank you very much. Yesterday, the leader of the UK Conservatives in the European Parliament caused deep offence when he compared the 200-strong Socialists and Democrats MEP group to the Nazis. This comes on the back of the British Foreign Secretary comparing the EU to the Soviet Union. Does the Minister agree with me that the Tories are poisoning the UK's image in Europe and the world, and that these narrow-minded British nationalists do not speak for Scotland?
Yes.
Michael Russell.
I would agree. I would agree. And if there were further evidence required of that, it would be in the questions from Murdo Fraser, which didn't address this as a serious issue, which addressed it from the narrowest partisan point of view, which damages all of us.
Maurice Golden, followed by Annabel Ewing.
Thank you. The statement makes clear that a no-deal scenario would be, and I quote, disastrous and indeed terrible for Scotland. Given this, why are the SNP, both here and Westminster, so desperate to vote for a no-deal?
Michael Russell.
Well, again, you see, that just shows the problem that the Conservatives have. The reality of the situation is nobody is desperate to vote for a no-deal. The only people who want a no-deal to take place are colleagues of Mr Golden's, many of them, some of whom are lauded by Scottish Conservative MPs, because a false choice is being presented, presiding officer. It is not a choice between the Chequers deal or no deal. I've indicated at some length other choices that exist. If the reality of the situation was addressed by the Conservatives and the seriousness of the situation addressed by the Conservatives, they would be responding to this. But they are in actual fact destroying the prospects of this country with this extremism that we hear.
Annabel Ewing, followed by Jackie Bailey.
Presiding officer, the Cabinet Secretary mentioned a moment ago the important issue of immigration. I wonder if he could set out what he sees as the specific impacts from the ending of freedom of movement and clarify whether the UK government has shown any flexibility at all on a differential immigration policy for Scotland.
Michael Russell.
They have shown, the UK government has shown no flexibility on migration at all. All we hear from the relevant ministers is the parroting of the phrase that says freedom of movement will end. The impact, we've published a variety of information on the impacts. I won't go through it just now, but there will be a very severe impact upon Scotland, both in terms of flow of EU migrants, because Scotland is not increasing itself naturally. We need to have migration. There will also be a severe effect as people are frankly turned off from staying in this country by the type of rhetoric that has been encouraged by the Conservatives.
Jackie Bailey, followed by Patrick Harvey.
The Cabinet Secretary rightly, in my view, recognises how disastrous a no-deal Brexit would be. Many would say it's all disastrous whether there is a deal or not. But I do want to ask him this, and it's something that troubles many people. If the UK government brings a deal to Parliament, which might not be everything that we want, will SNP MPs vote for it because it's better than no deal at all?
Michael Russell.
The only deal that would be possible that is acceptable beyond staying in the EU would be a single market and a customs union deal. Now, I don't want to equivocate on this because the reality of the situation is there are elements of the single market and the customs union deal which you would have to look at closely. And I know the member appreciates this. Freedom of movement, for example, the 4 freedoms are absolutely essential in these matters. So I have made it clear that a single market and customs union deal, one containing the elements, the important elements of the single market and the customs union, is conceivable as something that could go forward. But I am immensely resistant to the argument that the only choice is between Chequers, which has already been rejected by the EU, and no deal. That is not a realistic choice. It is a false choice. And it should not be put in a way that says choose one or the other, because neither are acceptable. But nobody wants to see a no deal. And the no deal that appears to be hurtling towards us is not because of the SNP. It's not because of Labour. It is because of the Conservatives. It is because of the 2 factions in the Conservatives, one of which wants a no deal, though that is unbelievable that there are people like that, but one of them wants a no deal, but the second faction is so incompetent they can't get a deal. So that is what we are faced with. But we should not accept the false dichotomy that is presented by the Conservatives.
Could I ask you, please, Mr Fraser, to stop muttering? It's becoming very annoying in my right ear, constantly. Thank you. Patrick Harvey, followed by Tavish Scott.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. On the point of the people's vote, the Minister says that we should find a way to ensure that Scotland is not left in the same position again, voting to remain but being taken out against our will. And I agree that that would be preferable. But can I ask him if, as does seem likely, some kind of 4-nation lock proves politically impossible to achieve, that should not stand in the way of a people's vote. That should not stand in the way of giving the public the opportunity to do what Westminster parties won't do, cancel Brexit and stop this mess.
Michael Russell.
I'm certainly not going to give away my desire to make sure that Scotland is not protected in those circumstances. But We have been clear, and we remain clear, that the SNP MPs will vote for a people's vote. And I think that is unequivocal. We will vote for a people's vote. I see a people's vote, presiding officer, not as a second chance, but as a verdict upon the Tories' stewardship of Brexit. And it would be a savage verdict.
Tavish Scott, followed by Emma Harper.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I thank the Cabinet Secretary for the statement in advance? Does he accept the principle of extending the transition period that the European Union proposed last week? And secondly, when and if there is no deal in March of next year, salmon, whitefish and mussels will be on the high seas from Lerwick to Aberdeen, which will be due to be in France by the next morning. What in heaven's name is going to happen to those businesses?
Michael Russell.
And the member knows that there will be live langoustines from the village of Tarbert in Argyll and other shellfish and other material that will be on the way too. And that is the question. And presently there is no answer to that, because there aren't enough phytosanitary inspectors to deal with those inspections, nor is there any guarantee that the goods will be accepted. And although the no-deal papers from the UK government say that material can come in without a check, that will not solve the problem we are talking about. The material coming in without a check will be open to fraud, undoubtedly. So this is a highly unsatisfactory situation, and I simply don't know the answer, and neither does the UK government. And that is a measure of the incompetence of these people. In terms of transition, if transition is required, then clearly there should be longer transition. It is interesting that the argument over transition has gone on for 2 years, and all the time people have said you'll need more than 21 months. It started with David Davis saying there would be no transition. I remember him saying it to me in October 2016 in Glasgow. And now, of course, they moved to transition of 21 months, and now they're talking about transition possibly up until the end of 2021 or beyond. But it has to be for something. And it cannot be, and this is absolutely clear, it cannot be instead of the backstop. If that is what Theresa May is proposing, and it appears to be in the bizarre statement she made on Monday, then it won't fly.
Emma Harper, followed by Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Has the Scottish Government had any indication from the EU that it is prepared to accept the argument from the UK Government that the Northern Ireland backstop should be temporary, as this may impact any movement through the Cairnryan port, which is in my South Scotland region?
Michael Russell.
No. There is no question of the backstop being temporary. That is entirely clear. And both sides will indicate that. So the solution has to be found by the Prime Minister moving from that position. And the Scottish Conservative Party moving from that position. Because the Scottish Conservative Party that appear to have been making some of the loudest noises on this, determined that Scotland should do as badly as possible out of any deal.
Liam Kerr, followed by Maureen Watt.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Just over 1 hour ago, John Swinney was telling this chamber why he will ignore its vote on P1 testing. So can the Cabinet Secretary tell me what effect, if any, a vote on the final EU deal in this Parliament would have? Or does the Scottish Government think that votes in this Parliament should be heeded only by others?
I think it would be inconceivable if this Parliament did not have the opportunity to say what it thought about this issue. If the Tories think it shouldn't, then one must ask, why are the Tories bothering to be elected here?
Maureen Watt, followed by Pauline McNeill.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Can the Cabinet Secretary say whether he's had any indication from the UK Government over how they intend to ensure access to European markets for the fresh fish processed in my constituency and elsewhere, and whether, in order to avoid damage to this product in transport due to the forecast lengthy waits at the channel ports, whether he will have these talks as a matter of urgency, as Angus MacDonald and I have both said, with the ferry companies to divert at least one ferry to use the Rosyth-Zeebrugge route.
Michael Russell.
I am sympathetic to the issue of direct transport from Scotland to and from the EU, and I hope that that can be arranged. But of course there are difficulties in so doing, and there have been difficulties in securing that route. But I would be very keen to continue to do so, and I'm sure my colleague, Cabinet Secretary for Transport, will wish to look at that too, and I shall discuss it with him. The point that the member raises about fish is exactly the point, essentially, that Tavish Scott has raised, that I've raised, that others raised, and it is one that requires a solution, but presently there is no solution to it. And that is the conundrum of the whole issue of no deal. There are matters in there which simply are not capable of solution, at least in the medium term, possibly even in the long term.
Pauline McNeill, and if she's quick, I'll manage to get Willie Coffey in too.
What demands will the Scottish Government make for a differentiated settlement? But more importantly, notwithstanding what the Minister said, when will he set out what a no deal actually means to the people of Scotland? Because I think they are entitled to know that. And does he agree with me that we should not contemplate a no deal on any terms?
Yes, I do, because I think that you could ask for an extension of Article 50, as I said before, if you can't get to the stage of getting an agreement and say a no deal is an impossibility. We've been arguing that for several months. Regrettably, that is not where the UK government has found itself. In terms of differentiation, I think we have indicated from the very beginning how we see a differentiated solution operating. We'll continue to do so. I think the issue now is, as I indicated in my statement, that we are essentially the only territory or nation in the UK that voted to stay that is not being offered differentiation. That is both unjust but also damaging, because there are issues such as migration in which we absolutely require differentiation, and the solutions being provided for the UK are not solutions that could possibly work for us. In terms of information no deal, I've indicated my timetable for that. I will do the best I can, but I don't want to stoke it.
The last question is Willie Coffey.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. The Secretary of State for Northern Ireland said on Monday that at the British-Irish Parliamentary Assembly that our government wanted an EU deal that works for Scotland. When I asked her who was best to determine what works for Scotland, she said that would be the UK Parliament. Does the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that this sums up the attitude of the Tories to Scotland, and that it's the Scottish Parliament that is best placed to decide what's best for Scotland?
Michael Russell.
How could I possibly disagree with that?
That concludes questions on the Minister's statement. We'll move on to the next item of business.
There is no time in hand, so I'm moving straight on, even as you get to your seats. The next item of business is a debate on motion 14425 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Scottish Government's inaugural contribution to international development report. Can I invite members who wish to speak in the debate to press the request to speak buttons now, and I call on Ben Macpherson to speak to and move the motion. Mr Macpherson, 7 minutes.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. A few weeks ago, I was at the Scotland-Malawi Partnerships AGM and learned a new phrase that I heard in relation to a project led by Link Community Development International. The phrase is "Onze Niko Fanika," which is Chichewe for "all people are important." It's a phrase that resonates with us in Scotland as it does in the warm heart of Africa. And in that spirit of equality, solidarity and internationalism, and building on the impressive work taken forward by my predecessors, Hamza Youssef and Alistair Allen, I'm very proud to open today's debate on the Scottish Government's inaugural report on the contribution to international development and to move the motion in my name. And in doing so, Presiding Officer, I think of all of those from around Scotland who play such an important part, that collective contribution to international development, and how much they would want us as MSPs to positively embrace this opportunity to consider the different ways in which Scotland makes a distinctive contribution towards addressing global poverty, inequality and other shared global challenges. I'm also mindful that next week, for example, this Parliament will host an event forming part of Tier Fund Scotland's 50th anniversary celebrations, because such events not only remind us of the history and richness of civil society's contribution to international development, but they also emphasise the strong cross-party support that exists in Scotland for international development, which is also active across the cross-party groups here in the Scottish Parliament. Presiding Officer, I'm also delighted to welcome the wider support that this inaugural report has received, and in particular the recognition that it reaffirms our strong commitment to the UN global goals. Indeed, our commitment and approach to international development programmes in our partner countries and to the Beyond Aid agenda aligns with the fundamental premise of the global goals, that being that governments cannot achieve them alone, but rather must work collectively. It is that concept of collaboration which underpins this report. And indeed, it is our commitment to collaboration that underpins the Scottish Government's international development work. Partnership with civil society, our universities, public bodies and other nations is key to all of our international development work. And it's our collaborative efforts across government, Scotland and our partner countries that this report really highlights and brings to life, demonstrating that when we come together for global good, together we can make positive change happen. The report itself highlights a multitude of projects and initiatives that our International Development Fund has supported in our partner countries to help achieve the global goals in Malawi, Rwanda, Zambia and Pakistan. For example, and these are just some of many examples, in Malawi, towards Global Goal 1 of no poverty, the report details that our Scottish Government international development support with partners has helped 2,860 farmers increase their wages by 227%. And 158 disabled Malawians increased their income by an average of 344% through our Global Concerns Trust's Livelihoods project. In Zambia, Global Goal 3 of quality education has been taken forward by our Open University in Scotland funded project, Zambian Education School-Based Training, which is helping to improve the quality of primary school teaching and learning in Central Province. In Rwanda, we are supporting water aid to improve health and sanitation in vulnerable communities and schools, contributing to good health, gender equality, clean water and sanitation. And in Pakistan, our scholarship schemes have enabled more young women from disadvantaged backgrounds to study at Pakistani universities and children from disadvantaged and minority backgrounds to attend primary and secondary school. But, Presiding Officer, this report goes wider than our International Development Fund to take a holistic look across the Scottish Government international development activity during 2017-18. And so it also reports on work funded from our Climate Justice Fund, our Humanitarian Emergency Fund, and importantly, the collaborative approach which we are increasingly developing across ministerial portfolios, a collaborative, stepwise approach which is committed to policy coherence for sustainable development, committed to our aim to do no harm to developing countries, committed to the Beyond Aid agenda, and committed to sharing Scotland's expertise for global good. For example, through our hydronation work, we are supporting and delivering peer-to-peer training and knowledge exchanges on drilling boreholes, water governance and resource management between our Scottish Government Water Division and the Malawian Government. This governmental partnership supplements the water mapping initiative highlighted in the report, which has seen approximately 30% of Malawi's water and sanitation assets mapped through our Climate Justice Fund, supported by Strathclyde University. In health, we have also seen, it's been hugely encouraging to see the joint development with the health portfolio of the Scottish Government to date to take forward our global health initiatives, an approach praised by Bill Gates in January when he visited Scotland. And lastly, in our wider public sector support, our funding supports Police Scotland to carry out specialist training with their peers in the Malawi and Zambian police forces on tackling gender-based violence and improving child protection and better protecting minority groups. Presiding Officer, my visit to Zambia and Malawi last month took place during UN Global Goals Week. The theme of Global Goals Week this year was the power of collaboration across government, the private sector, civil society, media and the UN. And that collaborative and supportive approach is what I hope that this report and today's debate will evidence. And I really look forward to hearing the contributions of fellow members from across the chamber about what we're doing in communities and in government and how we can achieve more together. Thank you.
And move the motion, please.
I already did, but I'll move
You
it
did.
again.
Well, that's good. I must have been drifting. No, I shouldn't have done that while you were speaking. I now call on Claire Baker to speak to move Amendment 14425.2. Tight 6 minutes, please, Ms Baker.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this important issue and welcome the Minister to his new role. This is the first contribution to international development report from the Government, and it is a welcome analysis of the work undertaken across portfolios and in our partner countries. I want to thank Tier Fund, SCIAF, Christian Aid and the Scotland-Malawi Partnership for their briefings in advance of our debate and for all the work that they do within the organisation and with civic society. It was in 2005 that the then First Minister, Jack McConnell, signed a cooperation agreement with the President of Malawi, and I am proud that this strand of the Scottish Government's work has grown with cross-party support. This agreement built on Scotland and Malawi's long history and ensured collaboration on education, health, sustainable economic development and civic governance. Initially, it was not without its critics, including from the then opposition SNP party, who argued that concerns over corruption and governance should delay the partnership, even though this would have meant delaying support for people who needed it. But it was a partnership that was supported by civic society and one that Scotland went into with its eyes open. A key part of our work then and now must be about supporting better governance. The Scotland-Malawi partnership make good points about the lack of genuine governance strengthening projects funded by the Scottish Government, and whether there is more that can be done to proactively develop governance projects, bringing government, parliament and civic society together. And I hope the Minister will reflect on this. Scotland's contribution to Malawi has been important and transformative, as the Minister highlighted from his recent visit. Increased wages, an increase in production, an increase in the number of children enrolled in schools are a few of the advancements. I am therefore pleased that 13 years on from its first signing, the First Minister has signed an updated joint agreement to ensure both countries continue to work together. The original agreement was the first step towards setting up our International Development Fund, which supports developing countries, assists in times of international crisis, and considers how our policies can positively affect the developing world. It is important that we continue to ensure there is policy coherence for development, as the Minister expanded on, and this report is a welcome step in that direction. I am pleased that the work of the Scottish Government continues to build on these successes, and I recognise the increase in the fund to £10 million per year, the establishment of a welcome annual climate finance fund of £3 million per year, and the introduction of a humanitarian fund of £1 million per year. Yet, despite Scotland and the UK's record, we can and must do more. 1 in 10 people live in extreme poverty, half of them in sub-Sahara Africa. 2 billion people live in countries affected by fragility, conflict and violence. 80% of illnesses in developing countries are linked to poor water and sanitation conditions. An estimated 131 million girls worldwide remain out of school, and over 21 million people are forcibly displaced by weather-related hazards every year. The Sustainable Development Goals set ambitious targets for us to meet. However, during times of financial constraint for governments, international development is often an easy target for those who wish to see aid cut, despite it being less than 1% of our gross national income. Against these calls, we must be clear that we will not waver in our determination to help others. It should be a source of pride that in both percentage and in cash terms, we are one of the most generous countries when it comes to helping others, and we must continue to meet the 0.7 target as set under the Millennium Development Goals. And I support the Scottish Government's recent contribution to the humanitarian tragedy in Indonesia. Of course, the UK Government will make a significant contribution on behalf of all of us, but we can demonstrate our empathy without distracting from our core business. We must also ensure we're not complacent when it comes to safeguarding. As a major funder for many charities within the sector, it is right the Government ensures that there are robust safeguarding policies in place to protect vulnerable groups, and that any such instances that we are aware of are fully and promptly investigated. We cannot just assume, as we had in the past, that these agencies are above reproach because of the work that they do. I welcome Oxfam's 10-point plan that they have published this week, and whilst I appreciate that much of what happened took place under umbrella organisations and away from Scottish offices, I still hope other charities continue to review their practices. Presiding Officer, the world is facing some of the most complex, interwoven security and development challenges of our time. Ongoing wars, unprecedented numbers of refugees, global terrorism, climate change and food insecurity. Our economic development was able to benefit from a model that is now hurting developing countries in Africa, Asia and South America. In June in the Parliament, I hosted an event for faith leaders in Scotland, coming together to call for strong action on climate justice, a recognition that the consequences of all our advantages and use of resources is negatively affecting the poorest countries in the world. That is why in our amendment today, we highlight the calls for the Government to commit to zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. We have a strong moral obligation to take action now, to set strong targets that resonate across the world and show that a different path is possible. Progress does not come by standing still. Since the 2009 Climate Change Act, many of the technologies that could help us reach our goal were only in their infancy or had yet to be developed. The opportunity and the imperative to be more ambitious than before is now here. We should take it. We must affirm our beliefs that tackling climate change is one of the biggest challenges that we face around the globe. Scotland must continue to be a beacon for change in the interest of everyone, and I move the amendment in my name.
Thank you very much. And I call Alexander Stewart to open the Conservatives. 5 minutes, please, Mr Stewart.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Delighted to be able to take part in today's debate and lead for the Conservative Party. And I welcome the Minister to his role. Many organisations across the country are doing so much with reference to international development. And we have seen significant advances in human development since 1990. The average lifespan is now 7 years longer than it was at that stage. And 130 countries now have universal enrolment in primary education. There remains, however, significant disparity between the most and the least deprived and developed countries, and many of these world's populations continue to face significant levels of poverty and deprivation. We in the Scottish Conservatives believe it is incredibly important that both Scotland and the UK Government as a whole play their part in supporting these individuals throughout their collaboration on international development. When it comes to international development, the Scottish Government seems particularly to excel at collaboration, Deputy Presiding Officer, and across business, across research, and importantly, across civic society. Using this approach to tie with the existing projects, the initiatives allow the £10 million budget which they have to go a lot further than it would do. There is no better example of this than the work that goes across the country in building with the long-standing relationship with Malawi. And as a co-convener of the cross-party group on Malawi, I have seen firsthand the exceptional work that has taken place. Like the Minister, I attended the AGM in Glasgow recently, which was an inspiring event with many individuals there showing of their talent and their time as to what they commit to. There are over 1,000 links between Scotland and Malawi throughout civic society, and they contribute towards this effect in so many ways. The Scottish-Malawi Partnership estimate that every pound spent by the Scottish Government Malawi Development Programme ensures that £10 is contributed by the wider civil society. This is an outstanding achievement, and we should be very proud of that. This report sets out some of the great achievements in Malawi and for other partner countries that have contributed towards the UN's global goals. In Malawi alone, the achievements include significant improvement on wages for many, more children enrolled in targeted schools, more girls able to access schools, and a fall in the mortality rate. These are all welcome factors. In fact, the approach of ensuring and leveraging money to support international development effects from sources other than government is one that we should see widely and more widely applied. As I've said before in this chamber, while it is of course we must continue to provide humanitarian assistance when it is required, we should, wherever possible, look to shift from the direct funding to ensure that self-sufficient and business enterprise model is taken up. I would therefore like to take this opportunity to welcome the announcement made this week by the Scottish Government on the United Nations Development Programme. We'll be collaborating on a 2-year programme to leverage private capital to help achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals. This is exactly the approach that we should be taking. However, there is an area that I would like to see the government do more on, and it already has been touched on today, which is the governance arrangements. Governance was the first stand of the original Malawi cooperation arrangement, and it still is a key priority looking forward in the partnership today. The Scottish-Malawi partnership have raised concerns about the lack of governance-related projects that the Scottish Government have funded in the last decades, and I share some of these concerns. We need to have a strong governance arrangement in place to ensure that the projects and Initiatives that support our partnership countries are successful. We would welcome more work on this area to bring forward governance projects that give the opportunity to open and respectful about the governance arrangements that do take place. Whilst this report indeed very much encourages what we've achieved, we must not forget that there are two governments actively involved in this whole process of international development. The UK government has long been committed to international development and since 2007 has legally bound to spend 0.7% of the gross national income on international aid, and we should be very much aware of that. In fact, in 2015, we were one of only 6 countries that were falling into the 0.7. This is something which should be, as I said, we were proud of. And in conclusion, Deputy Presiding Officer, we and the Scottish Conservatives are committed to ensuring that Scotland and the UK continue to be good global citizens. We are therefore wholeheartedly supporting the Scottish Government's international development initiatives in Malawi, in Zambia, in Rwanda and Pakistan, as well as the wider effects of the UK Government. We can and we do work together on so many areas, and these areas have made huge differences to the individuals, the organisations and the people of these nations. So I look forward to seeing what can be achieved as we progress from this situation, and I look forward to seeing successes in the future. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And I call on Ross Greer for the Green Party.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Like colleagues, I'd like to welcome the Minister to his post. Scotland's International Development Programme is a brilliant example of pushing the boundaries of devolution, living up to our global responsibilities and doing some genuine good in the world. We have both the responsibility to and the privilege of being able to act. The Greens welcome the principle of policy coherence being included in today's motion from the Minister. It's not the sexiest terminology in politics, but it's essential to our work here having real meaning. International development can't be isolated to a silo. Decisions taken across the portfolios of this Parliament, Westminster, Brussels, and even our council chambers do have impacts across the planet. My amendment, though unselected, drew 2 examples of that, and Claire Baker's amendment, which the Greens will support, makes the same case. The IPCC this month said that we're on course for 3 to 4 degrees of global warming. That's civilization-ending stuff. A crisis already devastating the most vulnerable people on this planet, one where many low-lying areas, island nations, densely populated river deltas face wipeout. Tens of millions, probably more, will lose their homes and livelihoods. Many will lose their lives, many indeed already have. The Government's development strategy includes a very welcome climate justice fund, one that's been gradually added to and increased over the years. These funds are vital for climate crisis mitigation work in the most vulnerable communities, for people who could not have done less to cause this crisis. But this year, BP invested over £420 million in 2 new North Sea oil sites. Since 2011, they've invested £2 billion in redeveloping the Schiehallion field, unlocking 450 million barrels of oil. We are spending a fraction of the billions being thrown into extracting even more oil and gas on mitigation efforts for the impacts of the climate crisis. Of course.
Stuart Stevens.
I wonder if the member has considered that, of course, oil and gas from our oil fields goes to transport in particular, and we should certainly work at getting it out of that, but it also is a currently irreplaceable feedstock for many of our industries.
I'd have to ask you to make a short intervention. Mr Greer is going to have to absorb that. Thank you.
Yeah, I appreciate the member's point, but if we are to have any hope of stopping the climate crisis, we need to leave over 80% of known reserves unburned. And at our current rate of burning versus use of these reserves for other purposes, we are burning far more than 80%, and of course the gas can only be used for burning. Indeed, the SNP's energy spokesperson Alan Brown MP was today praising a new report indicating that 15 billion barrels of oil could be extracted from the North Sea between now and 2050. The Scottish Government has repeatedly welcomed new oil and gas discoveries and has lobbied the UK Government for more support for that industry. These are not the actions of a party and a government serious about climate justice. This is not policy coherence. Neither is the Scottish Government's continued funding of companies who are involved in the arms trade, at the same time as supporting peace-building and reconciliation efforts through another department. Excellent efforts that we would all commend. But over £18.5 million has been given to arms companies over the last decade. Recipients include Raytheon, the world's largest guided missile producer. Their equipment's been used by a Saudi Air Force guilty of war crimes against children in Yemen. Celex Leonardo, who sold communications hardware to the Assad regime in Syria in the month that sanctions were imposed, have also received handouts, as did Chemring.
The member's concluding. Sorry, you've got 4 minutes and only 4 minutes.
The Minister can respond in his closing remarks. As did Chemring, who manufacture tear gas, which has been used against protesters from the Arab Spring in Egypt to pro-democracy protests in Hong Kong. Not a single human rights assessment has been carried out on any of these companies prior to funding. It's difficult to reconcile the support for arms companies with our commitment to human rights, for which I know the Minister is a powerful advocate. I appreciate the Scottish Government have introduced new guidance to suggest that human rights checks should be carried out before granting funding, but the status of that guidance remains unclear and improvements need to be made. Clearly, there is much more work to be done to ensure that policy coherence is achieved. I'm sure the Government would rather avoid accusations of hypocrisy or incoherence. I know the Minister is committed to making this Government's international development work a trailblazer across the world. I hope the Government can turn its words into actions and with coherence and commitment demonstrate Scotland's commitment to just international development.
Thank you. Sorry to chase people, but it's a short debate with very short time for speaking. I now call Liam MacArthur. 4 minutes, please, Mr MacArthur.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. Can I also start by formally welcoming the Minister to his post, and from our work together on the Justice Committee. I'm confident he will be an able and conscientious Minister, and wish him well in that role. As co-convener, like Alexander Stewart, of the Malawi CPG, I was delighted that one of Ben Macpherson's first engagement after his appointment was to visit the warm heart of Africa. I've been fortunate over the last decade or so to make a number of visits to Malawi, and I never cease to be amazed by the extent of the links between our two countries and inspired by the benefits these links from the grassroots up are delivering for communities both here and in Malawi. I appreciate that this contribution to International Development report, which I very much welcome, covers a very wide range of issues, but I hope the Chamber will understand if I focus my brief remarks this afternoon on the issue of Malawi, although in passing I should indicate my support for the amendment from Claire Baker. As I say, the historic friendship between Scotland and Malawi has, over recent years, given rise to a very distinctive and successful approach to international development being taken by successive Scottish governments, dating back to the work of Jack McConnell and the signing of the first cooperation agreement in 2005. The government-to-government and parliament-to-parliament assembly links work in synergy with a wider collective effort across schools, churches, universities, hospitals, community groups, businesses and all sections of civil society. There is not a part of Scotland that does not have a story to tell about the links it shares with communities and counterparts in Malawi. I believe the Scottish Government's efforts have a disproportionate impact and enjoy such popular support precisely because of their connections and this interplay with the wider civic efforts. In areas such as health, education, particularly for girls and women, sustainable development, projects are delivering tangible and hopefully long-lasting benefits to the people of Malawi. There is more, of course, that can and needs to be done, not least in relation to governance, as Alexander Stewart, I think, rightly mentioned. But we should be proud of what has already been achieved in a model of engagement and partnership that is increasingly seen as an exemplar for other countries and by the United Nations. In that context, I think it's perhaps appropriate to flag up some misgivings about the decrease in the scale of the Malawi Development Programme announced recently by the Scottish Government. For the reasons I've already outlined, the case is compelling for ensuring that Malawi remains the prevailing focus for Scotland's international development and engagement strategy. It is a matter of fact that the Scottish Government doesn't have the wherewithal to replicate the scale of what the UK Government does through DFID. With 1,000 times less financial resources at our disposal, Scotland needs to target that resource in ways that can make the biggest difference. Concentrating on initiatives that build on the unique and proven Scottish model, which sees government, parliament and civil society coming together in a focused and impactful way in one country-to-country and people-to-people partnership makes sense. This chimes with the new global partnership which the UN's Sustainable Development Goals look to deliver, and it is a reason not to set ourselves up as a mini DFID with the risk that we spread our efforts too thinly and thereby ineffectively. On a more positive note, maybe if you can pick up in your...
No, the members coming to conclusion.
On a more positive note, however, let me conclude by paying tribute to the far-sighted investment by successive Scottish governments in networks like the Scotland-Malawi Partnership and its sister Malawi-Scotland Partnership. Each pound invested in the SNP helps lever over £160 of inputs from wider civil society. That is a remarkable return and the sort of area where Scottish ministers with relatively modest input are able to leverage wider investment and deliver lasting change. Deputy Presiding Officer, our relationship with Malawi encapsulates the very positive contribution that Scotland has and can continue to make to international development, and look forward to supporting those efforts into the future. Sukomo Komberi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr MacArthur. My members now speaking. It's 4-minute speeches. Annabel Ewing, followed by Jeremy Balfour.
Presiding Officer, I'm pleased to be called to speak in this afternoon's debate on the newly instituted report on Scotland's contribution to international development, and this report has been widely welcomed and I do believe represents an important step in our continuing work to ensure that Scotland discharges its role as a good global citizen. At the outset, I would also like to take this opportunity of publicly welcoming the Minister to his new post, and I know that he will do a fantastic job. At the same time, I would pay tribute to the work of his immediate predecessor, Alistair Allen, who was assiduous in his work to tackle poverty and inequality across the globe. Presiding Officer, it is clear from this report that much progress continues to be made in terms of Scotland's contribution to the international development field. In addition to the very significant funding available from the Scottish Government and the high standards of transparency in place, what is extremely heartening is that the report recognises the importance of working across government portfolios so we can see the full weight of government brought to bear on seeking to improve, for example, the health and education of some of the world's poorest citizens and on helping them to meet the significant challenges of climate change. But in my view, what is the most significant of all is the importance that the Scottish Government places in its international development work on real two-way partnership working with civic society both here and in the third countries involved. This approach marks out the distinctive way that Scotland makes its contribution to international development and has been widely commended by our peers. We need look simply to the enormously important work that members have talked about that is taking place in Malawi to see how this distinctive approach is delivering on the ground. Indeed, the Scotland-Malawi Partnership have pointed out that this key approach of real joint working, nation to nation, citizen to citizen, acts as what they term a civic multiplier. We have heard that for every £1 spent on the Scottish Government Malawi Development Programme, over £10 of inputs comes from wider civil society. This innovative approach has seen some 109,000 Scots actively involved in some way with a link in Malawi, and indeed some 208,000 Malawians involved. What a fantastic hand of friendship that we all benefit from, and this can be seen in every constituency in Scotland. In my constituency of Cowdenbeath, I would like to mention the tremendous work being done by Dalgety Bay Parish Church, which has been twinned with the congregation of, and I probably won't pronounce this properly, Nkongolweni Church in rural northern Malawi since 2007. At the same time, the Dalgety Bay Friends of Nkongolweni was set up some years ago, and as a result of the work of all involved, under the secretaryship of Robin Arnott, together with the church, there have been some amazing achievements. The work done and money raised has, amongst other things, secured clean water for the village, funded and stocked a pig farm, paid for the secondary school fees for 8 pupils, expected to rise to 80 pupils over the next years, and with the proceeds from the pig farm, maize for orphans and widows has been purchased so that they will have food to eat when supplies are otherwise scarce. Elsewhere in my constituency, Beath High School, partnered with Mendulo School in the Lushenza region, is just back from a visit to Malawi, and other schools, including Dalgety Bay Primary School, Donnybistle Primary School and Lochgelly High School, all have active two-way school-to-school links with schools in Malawi. These links on the part of our citizens with the citizens of Malawi are not just transforming lives in Malawi, Presiding Officer, but are inspiring generations of young Scots to be good global citizens. I am very proud of the fantastic work going on in my constituency, and I'm also very proud, Presiding Officer, of the groundbreaking role that my country is playing in the field of international development, ensuring indeed that we live up to Burns' vision that man to man, the world o'er, shall brothers be for all that. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Ms Ewing. Jeremy Balfour, followed by Colin Smith.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. And like I think everyone so far, can I thank the Government for bringing forward this debate and welcome the report that we are talking about. I think, as my colleague Alexander Stewart has pointed out, I think one of the things Scottish Government have got right in regard to this is looking to partner with organisations both here in Scotland, but perhaps more importantly in other countries, because for that we get much more for our value. I'm pleased that Rosgea is sponsoring the Tier Fund event, and the Minister is coming to speak at it next Tuesday, and to be able to celebrate the 50 years that Tier Fund has been working across the United Kingdom and in other parts of the world. In the short time that I have, I would like to just mention 2 projects that I had the pleasure of visiting, which are sponsored by Scottish Government over the summer. I had the advantage to go with Tier Fund to Rwanda, and to be honest, I wasn't sure what to expect. It was my first trip to Africa. But what I saw impressed me and inspired me. But I think perhaps what I didn't expect, it challenged me to bring back some of the ideas that are happening in that country that I think we can learn from here in Scotland as we look to help people in our own country. I think on the second day that we were there, we were taken into one of the more deserted parts of the country, taken for about a mile's walk along this path to suddenly see this large Scottish flag standing there. And the reason it was is because the Scottish Government over a number of years have put money into water projects in Rwanda. And there was a lovely Scottish flag and a Rwandan flag, and perhaps more importantly, a tap that served 5 different villages that gave them water that they didn't have previously. That project wasn't delivered by Scottish Government, it was Scottish Government money delivered by a local partner. And I think that pays credit to what the Scottish Government have done. The second project, or several projects that we visited, was in regard to self-help groups. The Scottish Government have been funding 2 particular groups in regard to farming and environmental issues in Rwanda. But again, what challenged me was that there were 20 individuals in a village that had real poverty. They had got together, these 20 individuals, mostly women, into a self-help group where each month they put aside a small amount of money that was building up over a number of months, which in due course those individuals could borrow from to buy things to help them grow things for their village and for their local community. Every individual within that self-help group had been able to pay back the money that they borrowed and were growing the work that they were doing. Again, money given by Scottish Government, but delivered locally by local partnerships, which again to me is deeply effective. I think that is the way forward, but I think we also have to make sure that we learn lessons from them and from those countries, as well as us giving money and perhaps helping them. Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. Colin Smith, followed by Bill Kidd. Last speaker, Mr Kidd, in the open debate. Mr Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. As convener of the cross-party group on fair trade, I want to focus my comments in the very brief time we have on the importance of fair trade and the crucial role of civic society in Scotland in the promotion of international development. Presiding Officer, as we edge closer to the Brexit cliff with the prospect of our trade rules being rewritten and new trade deals being negotiated, it's no exaggeration to say it will be make or break for millions of farmers and workers in the world's poorest countries who trade with us. So the fair trade principles of better prices, decent working conditions, local sustainability and fair terms of trade for workers have never been more important. Fair trade challenges the injustices of conventional trade, injustices that too often discriminate against the poorest producers. That's why the campaigning work of the fair trade movement and others to deliver trade justice for millions of vulnerable farmers and workers in developing countries is as crucial today as it has ever been. So I want to pay tribute to the volunteers and campaigners across Scotland who promote those fair trade principles week in, week out. Earlier I mentioned my role as convener of the cross-party group, and that's a group that has been at the forefront of supporting fair trade, from welcoming producer visits to Parliament to last month hosting the launch of the new International Global Fair Trade Charter, along with the Chief Executive of the World Fair Trade Organisation, the Chief Executive of the Fair Trade Foundation and the Cabinet Secretary for External Affairs. It ensured that Scotland was one of the global focal points for the international fair trade movement. But as well as being convener of the cross-party group, I also have the privilege of being chairperson of my local steering group, local regional fair trade steering group. It means I see at first hand the commitment of local fair trade groups, local businesses, workplaces and the local council in Dumfries and Galloway to fair trade. And I was proud last week to sign off our application for continued fair trade status for the region. I also had the pleasure of welcoming the Scottish Fair Trade Forum to Dumfries last month for their annual conference, when campaigners from local groups across Scotland gathered to share ideas, to hear from others and to develop new plans, and also to welcome Killinbarrow rice farmers who are visiting Scotland from Malawi as part of a UK-wide tour supported by Paisley-based Just Trade in Scotland. In an age of uncertainty, cynicism and fake news, the conference and Scotland's international links are a real example of how a community-based grassroots approach strengthens the commitments to global connections and to development. It highlights the point made earlier by the Minister that networks and civic society partnerships linking to communities and partnerships globally are central to the success of Scotland's long-standing commitment to international development. The Fair Trade networks are supported by the work of the Scottish Fair Trade Forum, who supply information, knowledge, training and resources to local fair trade groups and promote fair trade businesses here in Scotland. Presiding Officer, from the launch of Campaign Coffee Scotland in 1979 to the first Scottish fair trade towns, Aberfeldy and Strathern, in 2002, Scotland has always played a leading role in developing fair trade. There have been many milestones along the way, from the opening of Ballast Sport in 2014, a Glasgow-based fair trade sports ball social enterprise, to the launch of the World Fair Trade Tartan in 2017 through a partnership between Village Works Cambodia and Fair Trade Scotland Limited. A tartan, I have to say, which I and the Minister will agree makes for a very excellent tie. Now, the Scottish Fair Trade Forum has supported many of those milestones, and their work has led to a step change in fair trade activity in Scotland, resulting in fair trade nation status in 2013, reconfirmed last year. So I commend the Scottish Fair Trade Forum for the work that it does and its vision to take fair trade to the next level in Scotland. I would strongly urge the Scottish Government to continue the welcome support it gives to the forum. Presiding Officer, in concluding, we have rightly heard much in this debate about the important and necessary role of aid in development, but we cannot and should not underestimate the essential role trade also has on international development. And that means we must continue to put support and fair trade at the heart of the Government's contribution to international development.
Thank you. I call Bill Kidd.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and welcome to Ben Macpherson's important new role. Scotland is a country with a rich network of NGOs, charities and academic centres focused on international development, and many of these groups work in collaboration with or are funded by the Scottish Government. This collective effort mirrors the United Nations 2015-2030 Global Goals Agenda, the goals of which are embedded into a number of Scottish Government policy areas such as tackling poverty, taking climate action and, of course, international development. I believe that Scotland can deliver ethical leadership through adopting international standards of best practice and by seeing policy coherence as a key aspect of the Beyond Aid agenda reverberate through our domestic and international development policy. We must embrace policy coherence for aid to work effectively. Coupled with this, we need to ensure that communities within aid recipient countries are treated as partners and collaborators. Policy coherence ensures that development work that is done abroad is not undermined by policies taking place at home. The UN Global Goals even outline the Government's integration development policy coherence must be a precursor for these global goals to be achieved. I would like to highlight the Scottish Government's Sustainable Energy for All, or SE for All, programme as an example of where policy coherence works currently well here in Scotland. SE for All projects are aimed at reducing energy inequity and building climate resilience in Malawi through renewable technology and education initiatives. This echoes the Scottish Government's ambitious and far-reaching climate targets set out in bill form, which are still developing but which are far-reaching. The Scottish Government is committed to making Scotland sustainable whilst curbing our carbon emission impact on the world. Nearly 1 in 5 people around the world do not have access to modern energy services, and this consequent lack of energy resulted in an estimated 2 to 3% loss of GDP in developing countries over the period of the Millennium Development Goal agenda. In Malawi, only 9% of the population have access to electricity, and this falls to only 1% in rural areas. In 2014, Scotland had the honour of welcoming Special Representative and Chief Executive of UN Sustainable Energy for All initiative, Dr. Kanda Yumkela, to Glasgow for the Commonwealth Conference on Energy, Equity and Development. In this, he emphasised that energy inequity impacts on the running of hospitals and health services, on water availability, on food security and on schools. Tackling this is crucial. The funded SE for All projects target energy inequity by working directly with rural communities to plant renewable technologies with local businesses. This mirrors international standards. In 2011, when the UN initiated this programme under Ban Ki-moon, he explained how renewable technology is the golden thread connecting development, social inclusion and environmental protection. Empowering and working in partnership with the aid recipient communities has powered 2 schools and health clinics with renewable energy and has resulted in 795 households purchasing these services and products in 4 rural villages in the Chikwawa district. All of this illustrates how Scotland has employed lessons of best practice from the development community beyond aid strategies, promoting policy coherence, community empowerment and partnership, and these are widely called for. Scotland and the Scottish Government adoption of Beyond Aid strategy amplifies our efforts to achieve global goals. As a small nation with a global reach, we can make it known that Scotland is an advanced, sustainable and ethical country through consistency and integrity. Thank you.
Thank you. Colin Lewis-MacDonald to close for Labour 4 minutes, please.
Thank you very much. I too welcome the new Minister and this new report. Today's debate has confirmed that the contribution of the Scottish Government to international development continues to enjoy strong cross-party support, as it has done indeed since it was initiated by Jack McConnell back in 2005, when Patricia Ferguson was appointed as Scotland's first International Development Minister. It has also confirmed a larger truth, that Scotland's contribution is not confined to government alone. It involves and engages tens of thousands of people across civil society. Members today have focused mainly on the partner countries of Malawi, Zambia, Rwanda and Pakistan, while acknowledging that Scotland also makes a wider contribution directly and indirectly in many countries around the world. And that point in particular is well made by Scotland's International Development Alliance, with whom I work closely as convener of the cross-party group on international development. The Alliance has over 140 member organisations working in around 140 countries around the world. Their view is that reporting on Scotland's contribution to international development should not be confined to what the government does at its own hand or to the 4 partner countries, but should cover all of those organisations which are active in all of those countries. The other point emphasised by those working in the development field is that this policy area is not for one minister or one department alone. It is important across the whole range of government, as indeed Ben Macpherson himself highlighted. In that context, the Minister's presentation of this report in the context of the UN Global Goals is very welcome. These goals reflect recognition that development in other countries is intrinsically linked with development at home, as a number of members have said today, and that the steps we need to take to support the world's poorest countries are linked to the steps we need to take to achieve sustainable and inclusive development here in Scotland. That is why our amendment, or the context in which our amendment today highlights the case for Scotland setting a target of zero net emissions by 2050. And that case, as the ministers will know, has strong support among NGOs. It reflects the point that climate change has the greatest impact on those who did least to cause it, and the need for countries like Scotland to take a larger share in the actions needed to mitigate that, a point in general terms stressed by both Ross Greer and Liam MacArthur and indeed others. Claire Baker and Alexander Stewart mentioned the views of the Scotland-Malawi partnership in calling for more Scottish Government support for governance-related projects in Malawi. They say that it is regrettable that there have been few of those in the last decade, and that is something that needs to be addressed. I think all of us in this Parliament know from our own experience that the best actions and indeed the best investments can be undermined if they don't have good governance to ensure that they're delivered. And with this broadest and deepest and in some ways oldest of Scotland's international partnerships, I think we should take heed of this call from the Scotland-Malawi partnership for a rebalancing of our effort going forward. Incorporating the Sustainable Development Goals in Scotland's own national performance framework will make it easier to achieve the policy coherence for international development to which the Minister referred, and I think is a step in the right direction. But we can never be complacent or rest on our laurels. The need for global action for development and justice is urgent and serious. Our efforts must be constantly reinvigorated by recognising and responding to new challenges and by finding new ways to add value to those efforts. On that basis, I am certain that there will continue to be support across this Parliament for Scotland's contribution to international development and for policies which can tackle poverty and inequality, both here in Scotland and around the world.
Thank you very much. And I call on Jamie Green to close the Conservatives, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. It's been a very short debate, symptomatic of the many short debates we've had this week, so I'll attempt to do it as justice as best I can. I think it's fair to say there's been, admittedly, a lot of progress made internationally over the last couple of decades. According to the World Bank, there's been a 36% reduction in absolute poverty in the last 40 years. That's over 1 billion people that have been lifted out of absolute poverty. But let's not kid ourselves or forget that the world's population has exploded in that time, and over 1.5 billion people still do not have access to basic energy needs and rely on things like wood and charcoal for heating and cooking, things that we take for granted here in Scotland. And whilst I suspect the Scottish Government has no statutory requirement to dedicate either resource or funds to international aid, the fact that it does so is highly commendable. You see good practice and goodwill right across Scotland and across all walks of life, whether it's through the state-sponsored intervention detailed in this report, or through large-scale organisations such as Enactus or WaterAid Scotland, through to very local groups. In my region, the Valdetti Trust, based on the Isle of Arran, is a group helping people with degenerative diseases in Albania, of all places. So it's really heartening that it is within the Scottish psyche to support our friends, wherever they may be and whatever their needs are. This report focuses very much on the work that the government is doing in Rwanda, Malawi, Zambia and Pakistan. And many of these schemes are of long-standing relationships, some of which with historic importance. And there are countless countries and projects that I guess the government could invest in. So it has to make difficult decisions as to where it thinks Scottish intervention will have the most impact. Alexander Stewart mentioned some concerns over governance, but if I could also add some thoughts over effectiveness and value of our strategy. Currently, Scotland's International Development Fund allocates 20% of its budget towards capacity strengthening. And that funds projects such as Police Scotland working in Zambia. It also includes projects which trains Pakistani women in conflict resolution and peacekeeping. But the question is how does government ensure that every pound spent is spent effectively? If we look across the border, they set up an independent commission for aid impact. And the focus of that organisation is to evaluate how effective aid spending has been. The Department for International Development has a pledge at the moment to ensure that every pound spent on aid, there's at least a pound's worth of impact. You could argue that the impact should be more than that invested, but it's a good start. Now, I accept the analysis at that level is incredibly difficult, and I appreciate, as I said, that difficult decisions have to be made on what will have the biggest effect on those who need it. So I do wish the Minister well in regard, but I would ask that he does give some thought as to how he will evaluate how his budget is being spent and how he will alter future spending decisions. There is, in today's motion, there is the phrase used, cross-cutting themes on policy coherence for development. It's a little bit jargon-filled, I admit, but I do hope that that means that the Scottish Government accepts that aid cannot be given in a silo. It must have real impact on the communities that it delivers to. And I think projects like the Global Concerns Trust is an excellent example of that. It provides disabled people education in Malawi. It's allowed them to increase their income. It's helped create over 160 new businesses. And to me, that sounds like targeted aid delivering real tangible results. Helping countries develop business, invest in capital and human infrastructure, I think is the right kind of development projects that we should be encouraging. The revived African Lakes Company, Malawi Mangoes, Community Energy in Malawi, all great examples of projects with tangible benefits and tangible results. Presiding Officer, the notion of trade, not aid, is very common parlance in today's international aid circles. In fact, Nobel Prize winner Angus Deaton highlighted that development should not and never undermine local capacity. So our intervention should facilitate basics, but also facilitate business as well. I would like to make very brief reference to Labour's amendment today. I think it has noble intentions, but I do think it adds a new layer to today's debate, which we simply do not have enough time in 58 minutes to debate properly. I'd like the Clerk Committee to do its work and give it the time and space that it needs to report back to this place on emissions. I would also like the Independent Committee on Climate Change to do their work and inform both governments. So I'd like to see what they advise before we take a view on that. In closing, Presiding Officer, can I offer the Minister support from these benches on the work his department is doing, but can I do so with a request that if we truly want to leave no one behind, as his document says, then Scottish aid must be delivered effectively, productively, safely, and that everyone involved in doing so does so in an accountable way. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call on Ben Macpherson to close the Government Minister till decision time, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to all members who have participated in what I think has been an excellent debate. Before concluding remarks, I'll try and address some of the points made, just for clarity. First of all, on the question of diminished focus on Malawi that Liam MacArthur and Claire Baker raised also as well, we are absolutely committed to Malawi as a focused partner. In the 11.5 million that I announced for our new development assistance projects to 2018-23 includes a significant commitment to Malawi, including, which covers off this point as well, 1.2 million for civil society and governance work. And we are also funding capacity building gains through our small grants programme in order to develop on the governance question. And we have given that focus and priority in previous applications for programme proposals, but we will continue to encourage more Scottish organisations to come forward and partner with us on that, as well as taking forward our own initiatives. And just for clarity, 3 million per annum is designated.
Excuse me a minute, Minister. Angus MacDonald can't hear you, neither can I, because you have a very gentle voice, for which I commend you, but the noise of other members just saying their farewells to each other is interrupting you, so if they'd just be quiet. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I'll try and speak a bit louder then. Just for clarity, 3 million per annum is designated from the IDF for Malawi, and it receives the largest amount of funding through our International Development Fund. So let that be absolutely clear. And the points raised by Ross Greer, just for clarity, the Scottish Government and its enterprise agencies do not provide funding for the manufacture of munitions. I want to make that absolutely clear. Our agency's support is focused on helping firms to diversify and to develop non-military applications for their technology. Today we have heard so powerfully from most speakers about the partnership, working and collaboration in the way that the Scottish Government and Scotland as a whole approaches international development and the important impact that can make. And that is why, in opening this debate, I spoke of our commitment to policy coherence for sustainable development. And the report provides a summary of the Scottish Government's key contributions to the UN global goals in our partner countries under international development, humanitarian emergency and climate justice funds. But it also details how collaboration across the Scottish Government portfolios is increasingly delivering success beyond aid spend, including citizenship, education, partnerships on water with the Malawian Government, our global health network, and our to address the point, our climate change bill will add to this. I am passionate about tackling climate change and really respect those in the NGO sector and colleagues and others who are pushing and want a strong climate bill. The Scottish Government is also passionate about delivering this and delivering a strong bill within the limits of feasibility, and we have a question before us with the bill as that develops. But I think it's important to emphasise that tackling climate change in a purposeful, robust and achievable way will make the biggest impact and difference both here in Scotland and towards achieving the UN global goals. In all of the international development and humanitarian emergency work that we support, we aim to reflect our commitment to the partnership of achieving the global goal 17, including the civil society networking organisations to which we support. And this was emphasised by many speakers. I believe that our support for a wide range of international development organisations also helps us hear a myriad of views and voices, and that's important because it helps us to build a myriad of collaborations, not just to deliver development programmes, but also in order to progress LGBTI equality and rights, push for greater female empowerment, better protect those in marginalised groups, and enhance the influence of young people. And on safeguarding, which was rightly raised, I've been heartened by the commitment shown across the sector in Scotland to work together to effect culture change and safeguarding improvement. We have worked closely with the Alliance and Oscar to support the sector, in particular in funding the Alliance to develop a safeguarding support package, the pilot of which was launched last month at their annual conference. And on safeguarding and our commitment to it, to protect vulnerable people, we will continue to form an integral part of our international development work in the years ahead. It will continue to form an integral part, and we will continue to collaborate in doing so with DFID, Oscar, the Alliance and the wider international development sector. In conclusion, Presiding Officer, I've been delighted to present our international contribution to international development report and that it's received such positive feedback. However, I'm also clear that it will evolve over time in both format and content as we respond to our partners here in Scotland and in our partner countries. What will not change is our approach to international development itself, of focusing on areas where development investment is most needed and where it can be effective and deliver impact, of acting as a good global citizen, contributing internationally by reference to the interests of our partner countries and not our own interests. This is an approach that is in tune with our values, values of compassion, solidarity and internationalism. Presiding Officer, in this time of uncertainty and flux and challenge, those values are increasingly important. We should be proud of the collective achievement that our distinctive international development contribution has achieved, both the last year and since 2005. And we should be proud of the contribution we've made together for both the benefit of Scotland as a good global citizen and the intrinsic benefit of working together in the interests of others and for global good.
Thank you very much, and that concludes our debate on international development. We're going to turn straight to decision time, and the first question is that Amendment 14425.2 in the name of Claire Baker, which seeks to amend Motion 14425 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Scottish Government's inaugural contribution to international development report, be agreed. Are we all agreed? No. We're not agreed. We'll move to division. Members may cast their votes now. The result of the vote on amendment number 14425.2 in the name of Claire Baker is yes 22, no 80. There were no abstentions. The amendment is therefore not agreed. And the final question is that motion 14425 in the name of Ben Macpherson on the Scottish Government's inaugural contribution to international development report be agreed. Are we all agreed? Yes. We are agreed, and that concludes decision time. I close this meeting.
That's been done by Broadcasting Scotland in giving community activists, yes activists, Scottish activists a platform other than the traditional media outlets.